Hey, what if I told you that one of the most iconic products on the planet, sitting right now in over 195 countries on Air Force One, in NASA space stations and probably in your fridge, was invented by a guy who never once bragged about it? Not in interviews, not to journalists, not even in his own autobiography. We're talking about a tiny bottle, 3 ingredients, one swampy patch of land in Louisiana, and a family that has been offered billions, with a B, to sell, and keeps saying no for over 150 years. This is not a business story. This is an obsession story. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this right now. Seriously, I want to know. And if you're into deep dives like this one, you already know what to do. Let us get into it. To understand how a tiny glass bottle of hot sauce became one of the most recognized products in the world, you first have to go back to a place and a time that had absolutely nothing to do with hot sauce. You have to go back to a small, mostly unremarkable town in western Maryland called Hagerstown. And you have to go back to the year 1841, when a 17-year-old boy named Edmund McElhenney watched his father die from cholera, and quietly realized that the life he'd been expecting to inherit simply did not exist anymore. Cholera, for those who have never had the pleasure of reading about 19th century public health, was the kind of disease that did not care about your social standing, your plans, or your general optimism about the future. It arrived fast, it was catastrophic, and it left families in financial ruin with remarkable efficiency. Edmund's father had been a man of modest but stable means, not wealthy, not connected to the kind of old money that opened doors in antebellum America, but capable of providing a reasonable foundation for a son to build on. When he died, that foundation dissolved more or less overnight. Edmund was left with Irish and Scottish blood in his veins, a decent enough education, a younger family that needed feeding, and precisely no inheritance to speak of. Not exactly the triumphant origin story most empire builders prefer to advertise. What he did have, however, was the particular kind of stubbornness that seems to run reliably through people who grow up in households where the word underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore was never used without some anxiety behind it. He was not the type to sit in Hagerstown and wait for circumstances to improve. Circumstances, in his experience, had a strong track record of not improving on their own. So he made a decision that a surprising number of ambitious young men from the Upper South made during the 1840s. He pointed himself toward New Orleans and started walking, metaphorically speaking. In practice, he probably took a series of increasingly unreliable riverboats, which in the 1840s was more or less the same thing. New Orleans in the 1840s was not a subtle city. It was loud, it was dense, it smelled strongly of the Mississippi River and various things the Mississippi River had carried in from several hundred miles upstream, and it operated on a commercial energy that made the rest of the American South look like it was taking a very long afternoon nap. Cotton moved through New Orleans in quantities that were difficult to comprehend. Sugar moved through it in volumes that were almost as staggering. The port was the busiest in the country by some measures, and the most chaotic by almost every other measure. Ships arrived from Europe, from South America, from the Caribbean, all of them feeding into a trading economy that had made a relatively small number of people extraordinarily wealthy, and had done so with a speed that still seemed slightly unreal to the people living inside it. If you were a young man arriving in New Orleans in the early 1840s with no family connections and no starting capital, the city presented you with an interesting problem. On one hand, money moved through the place so freely and in such volume that there was, in theory, opportunity everywhere you turned. On the other hand, the people who actually controlled that money, the plantation owners, the major trading houses, the old Creole families who had been running things since before Louisiana was even part of the United States, had no particular interest in sharing the structural advantages they had spent generations accumulating. The hierarchy was not written down anywhere. It did not need to be. Everyone understood it instinctively, the way you understand which seat at the dinner table belongs to the person who owns the house. The real power in antebellum New Orleans did not belong to the merchants or the traders, or even the brokers who handled the massive volume of cotton moving through the port. It belonged to the landowners. Specifically, it belonged to the men who owned the land outside the city. The great sugar and cotton plantations that stretched along the Mississippi and the Bayou country to the west. Those men did not need to hustle. The land worked for them. or rather the enslaved people on the land worked for them, and the returns were enormous and largely self-perpetuating. A man with 10,000 acres of productive sugarland in Louisiana in 1845 was not worried about next year's income in any meaningful sense. He was thinking about the next generation, and the generation after that, and which family his daughter should marry into to consolidate another 5,000 acres. That was the world Edmund was walking into, and he understood almost immediately that if he wanted to operate anywhere near that level, he needed to find the mechanism that connected ambition to capital. He chose banking. It was, in retrospect, an extremely sensible choice, though it did not look particularly glamorous from the outside. Banking in the antebellum South was not a stable or particularly well-regulated profession. Banks appeared and disappeared with some regularity. Panic swept through the financial system every few years and wiped out institutions that had seemed solid the week before. The rules governing what banks could and could not do were loose enough that a determined and creative person could essentially invent the version of banking they wanted to practice, which was either an exciting opportunity or a terrifying liability, depending on your perspective and your personal relationship with risk. Edmund apparently found it exciting. He started at the bottom, which is another way of saying he started where every person without connections starts, doing the work that nobody else wanted to do, learning the mechanics of the business from the inside out, making himself useful enough that the people above him kept finding reasons to keep him around. He was good with numbers, he was good with people, which in banking is often more important than being good with numbers, and he had that particular quality that is genuinely difficult to teach, the ability to look at a financial situation and see not just what it was, but what it could become under the right set of conditions. Banks in New Orleans survived by understanding the agricultural cycle of the plantation economy, by knowing when planters needed credit to get through the gap between planting and harvest, by understanding the rhythms of the cotton market well enough to make loans that would actually be repaid. Edmund learned those rhythms. He internalized them in the way that people who grew up without financial cushions tend to internalize the mechanics of money, with a thoroughness born of the understanding that getting it wrong was not an abstract problem. By the 1850s, he was no longer a young man doing unglamorous work at the bottom of the ladder. He had built a reputation, he had built relationships, and he had built, quietly and methodically, a position within the New Orleans financial community that gave him access to the kind of conversations that happened in rooms you did not get invited into unless you had already proven you belonged there. He married into a family that helped consolidate his social position. His wife, Mary Eliza, came from a background that connected him to the world of plantation ownership in ways that pure banking success could not quite achieve on its own. This mattered enormously in a society where the line between financial respectability and genuine social acceptance was drawn with meticulous care, and where the people on the right side of that line were very much aware of who was standing just outside it. By 1860, Edmund McIlhenny owned 5 banks. Let that sit for a moment. A man who had arrived in New Orleans roughly 2 decades earlier with nothing but some Irish-Scottish stubbornness and a willingness to do the unglamorous work had, by the eve of the Civil War, built a personal financial empire that made him one of the more prosperous men in a city that contained a remarkable concentration of prosperous men. His personal fortune by 1860 has been estimated at around $112,000. In today's money, that translates to somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 million, which sounds moderately impressive until you remember that he had built it from an effective starting point of zero in roughly 20 years, in a city with no safety net and no tolerance for failure, during a period that included multiple financial panics, regional economic instability, and a social structure designed specifically to keep people without inherited advantages from accumulating too much of the pie. It was, to put it plainly, a genuinely remarkable achievement. Edmund himself probably would not have used that word for it. He would have called it work. The city around him, however, was moving towards something that no amount of careful financial planning could account for. The tensions between the southern states and the federal government had been building for decades, over tariffs, over the expansion of slavery into new territories, over the fundamental question of whether a nation could continue to function half slave and half free, without eventually being forced to answer that question with something more decisive than a political compromise. By 1860 it was clear, at least to anyone paying close attention, that the answer was going to involve armies. Edmund, as a banker with significant investments in the plantation economy of Louisiana, was embedded in a financial system that was inseparable from the institution of slavery. Whatever his personal views on the matter, and the historical record is not particularly illuminating on this point, his economic fate was tied to the fate of the Confederacy in ways that were not going to be comfortable. But before the war came and rearranged everything, there was the matter of a piece of land about 140 miles west of New Orleans, sitting in the marshes and bayous of Iberia Parish, that was about to reveal something genuinely extraordinary hiding just beneath its surface. And the discovery of that something would, in a sequence of events that nobody could have predicted, eventually lead directly to that tiny bottle sitting in your kitchen cabinet. The place was called Avery Island, which is one of those names that requires an immediate asterisk. It is not, in any conventional geographical sense, an island. It does not have water on all four sides. It does not require a boat to access. What it actually is, underneath the live oaks and the Spanish moss and the thick subtropical vegetation that drapes over everything in southern Louisiana like the land itself, is trying to keep its secrets, is something considerably more peculiar and considerably more useful than a standard island. Avery Island is a salt dome. More specifically, it is the surface expression of a massive underground column of rock salt that punched its way upward through the surrounding sediment over millions of years, creating a raised mound of land, roughly 2 miles long and a mile wide, that sits above the surrounding wetlands at an elevation that, in Louisiana, qualifies as genuinely impressive. The geology of this is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is the kind of geological fact that sounds made up but is, inconveniently, entirely real. Deep beneath the Gulf Coast, extending down through Louisiana and into the floor of the Gulf itself, there are vast deposits of evaporate minerals, salt and other compounds left behind by ancient seas that existed in this region hundreds of millions of years ago. In most places, these deposits stay buried and behave themselves, but in certain locations, usually where the overlying sediment layers are thick and heavy enough, the salt begins to flow. Salt, despite being a solid, will actually deform and move under sufficient pressure over sufficient time, flowing upward through the surrounding rock the way a very slow-moving fluid would, seeking the path of least resistance, pushing upward toward the surface. The result is a salt dome, a roughly cylindrical or oval column of relatively pure salt that has risen from depths of several miles toward the surface, pushing the overlying rock layers up and to the sides as it goes. The salt dome beneath what would become known as Avery Island is one of the largest and most accessible in North America. Geologists who have studied it have estimated that the column of salt extends downward for a distance that exceeds the height of Mount Everest above sea level. Read that again slowly. The deposit goes deeper than Everest is tall. The surface of Everest sits at roughly 29,000 feet above sea level. The salt beneath Avery Island goes down further than that below the surface of the Earth. This is the kind of geological fact that makes you feel briefly that the normal rules governing the physical world have been suspended in this particular corner of Louisiana, which, if you have ever spent any time in Louisiana, does not feel entirely inconsistent with the general atmosphere. The raised dome of land had been owned for generations by the Avery family, who had settled there in the early 19th century and built a substantial sugar plantation on the elevated ground. The McIlhenny connection came through Edmund's marriage. The Avery family and the McIlhenny family were linked by marriage in the way that prominent families in the antebellum South tended to link themselves to one another, creating overlapping networks of land ownership, commercial interest, and social obligation that served as the actual infrastructure of power in the region. Edmund himself had not yet moved to the island in any permanent sense, but he knew the land, knew the family that owned it, and would eventually come to know it far more intimately than he might have anticipated. The island's extraordinary secret had been suspected by locals for years before it was confirmed. There were surface indications, salt springs seeping up in certain spots, concentrations of mineral-tasting water in the wetlands around the dome's edges. The local indigenous people had known about the saltiness of the area long before any European settlers arrived. But the actual commercial discovery, the moment when someone put a shovel into the ground and hit something solid and white and economically significant, did not come until the spring of 1862. By May of that year, the Civil War was already more than a year old, and going badly for Louisiana in several specific ways. The Union naval blockade of southern ports, which had been tightening steadily since the early months of the conflict, had created a problem for the Confederacy that sounds almost comically mundane given everything else that was happening. The South was running out of salt. This is not a small problem when you think about what salt was used for in 1862. Refrigeration did not exist. The primary method of preserving meat for an army in the field was salt packing. Salt was used to preserve fish, to cure hides, to process food for civilian populations, to feed livestock, to process the raw materials that fed dozens of industries. A modern army needs a great deal of things, most of them obvious: ammunition, weapons, food, medical supplies. A 19th century army needed all of those things, plus enormous quantities of salt just to keep the food from spoiling before it reached the men who needed to eat it. The Confederacy had historically relied heavily on imported salt, and on salt produced at facilities in Virginia, in the Western Territories, and along the Gulf Coast. The Union blockade was cutting off the imports. Union military operations were targeting the production facilities. By the spring of 1862, Confederate supply officers were dealing with what was, in the unglamorous but genuinely critical logistics of 19th century warfare, a genuine crisis. Salt prices had exploded across the South. Civilians were buying it in quantities that reflected real anxiety about future availability. Military planners were treating it with the seriousness usually reserved for ammunition. The Confederacy did not need another thing to worry about, and yet here was salt, causing significant problems. It was in this context that workers on Avery Island, digging for reasons that the historical record describes somewhat vaguely, but which probably had to do with the known surface saltiness of the area, broke through the ground at a depth of roughly 16 feet, and found themselves looking at something that had never been commercially identified in the United States before. They had hit a deposit of rock salt, not brine, not a salt spring, but actual solid crystalline rock salt, almost perfectly pure, sitting there in massive quantities as if it had been waiting politely for someone to show up with the right tools. The timing was, from the Confederate perspective, essentially miraculous. Word travelled quickly. The Confederate government, which was in the middle of trying to manage a war with a supply chain that was being systematically dismantled by Union military pressure, recognized immediately what they had found. Avery Island was not just a salt deposit. It was a strategic asset. It was potentially the answer to a problem that had been causing genuine operational difficulties for the Southern war effort for over a year. The island was promptly converted into a military production facility with a speed and thoroughness that reflected the urgency of the situation. What followed was an operation of considerable scale by the standards of the time and place. Workers, enslaved people primarily, doing the actual labour of extraction in conditions that were brutal even by the standards of 19th century industrial work, were put to work pulling salt out of the ground in quantities that would have seemed fantastic to anyone who did not have the geological evidence in front of them. The operation was not subtle, it was not careful, it was a wartime extraction effort with a single objective: get as much salt out of the ground as quickly as possible and get it to the Confederate armies and civilian populations who desperately needed it. Refinement of technique and long-term planning were, understandably, lower priorities than production volume. In the first full year of operation, the Avery Island Salt Works produced approximately 22 million pounds of salt. 22 million pounds. To put that in some kind of physical context, that is roughly the weight of about 3,000 large pickup trucks, extracted from a hole in the ground in the middle of the Louisiana marshland by a workforce operating under wartime conditions with 19th century equipment. The salt moved from the island to Confederate supply depots, and from there to garrisons at Vicksburg and Port Hudson, two of the most strategically important Confederate positions on the Mississippi River. If you had asked a Confederate logistics officer in late 1862 to describe the most important pieces of real estate in Louisiana, Avery Island would very plausibly have appeared on that list alongside things that had actual armies on them. The island had, in the span of a few months, transformed from a sugar plantation, with an interesting geological curiosity beneath its feet, into one of the most strategically significant pieces of land in the entire Western theatre of the Civil War. Edmund McIlhenny, observing this from his position in the New Orleans financial community, was watching the world he had carefully built over 2 decades begin to tremble. The war was coming for his banks. It was coming for the entire economic order that had made his 5 banks possible, and before long, it was going to come for the island itself. The scale of the salt operation also meant the scale of the target. Union commanders were not unaware that the Confederacy had found a substantial salt supply in southern Louisiana, Salt deposits, salt works, and salt supply lines were legitimate military objectives in 19th century warfare. Eliminating them was a straightforward way to degrade the enemy's logistical capacity, and Union strategists were methodical about pursuing exactly that kind of advantage. Avery Island, producing millions of pounds of salt for Confederate armies, was not a place that would be allowed to continue operating indefinitely. The production operation had also created something of a settlement around the salt works, not just workers but the infrastructure needed to support them, the processing buildings, the storage facilities, the equipment for extraction and purification. 18 structures in total by some accounts. They had been built quickly, built for function rather than permanence, built to produce salt as fast as the ground would give it up. Nobody had designed them with the assumption that Union troops might someday arrive with a specific interest in ensuring they stopped functioning. Edmund's family had moved to the island during the early period of the war, a decision that made sense at the time, given that the island felt more secure than New Orleans, which fell to Union Admiral David Farragut in April of 1862, almost exactly at the same moment the salt was first discovered. New Orleans in Union hands was New Orleans with Edmund's banks no longer operating under Confederate financial arrangements, which was another way of saying New Orleans with Edmund's banks in very serious difficulty. The island must have seemed like a refuge, a place slightly outside the reach of the rapidly deteriorating situation, a piece of solid ground in more than just the geological sense. It was not ultimately solid enough. But that part of the story, the fire, the flight, the return to something that no longer existed in the form it had left, belongs to the next chapter of what was about to become a very different kind of story. For now, what matters is understanding what the island was, what lay beneath it, and why a piece of swampy land in Iberia Parish was about to become the most important real estate in the entire McIlhenny family story. Not because of the salt. The salt mattered enormously for a brief terrible period of American history, and then it mattered in a different way, as the mineral backbone of a product that would eventually travel further and reach more tables than the Confederate supply officers could have imagined in their most optimistic moments. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Understanding the geology is necessary because the geology is, in a very literal sense, what made everything else possible. The salt dome did not just happen to be there. It had been there for millions of years, working its way upward through the sediment, pushing the island above the surrounding marsh, giving the Avery family elevated ground to build on, giving Edmund a place of retreat, giving Confederate salt works a location, and eventually, giving Edmund something to mix with ground peppers and vinegar in a process that nobody in 1862 was thinking about at all. Nobody standing at the bottom of a salt mine in wartime Louisiana, with the smell of the excavation in their lungs and the urgency of military supply logistics pressing down on every hour of every day, was thinking about hot sauce. They were thinking about survival. The landscape itself deserves a moment of attention, because it shapes everything that comes after. Southern Louisiana in the 19th century was not the kind of territory that rewarded the faint-hearted or the impatient. The land along the coast and in the bayou country was not so much firm ground, as it was a continuous negotiation between solid earth and water, a landscape that could look deceptively stable in dry conditions and reveal its true nature with uncomfortable speed during the rainy season or a hurricane. The bayous wound through marshland that was neither quite water nor quite land, supporting an ecosystem that was extraordinary in its richness and completely indifferent to human comfort. Spanish moss hung from every available tree branch with the casual abundance of something that had never been told it was only supposed to grow in one place. Cypress trees rose from the water on their knobby root structures, looking like the result of a very committed attempt to grow a forest in a lake. Alligators were not a metaphor or a regional mascot. They were present and they were real, and they had opinions about who was walking near their preferred resting spots. Opinions they were not shy about expressing. The air in summer was the kind of thick, heavy heat that feels less like temperature and more like something you need to move through physically, a substance rather than a condition. Mosquitoes operated at volumes that made you appreciate, in a new and personal way, every piece of fine mesh netting ever manufactured. And yet people built lives here, built them stubbornly, generation after generation, because the same conditions that made the landscape difficult also made it remarkably productive. The bayou soil was rich. The waterways provided transportation in a region where building roads was difficult, and keeping them passable was an ongoing argument with the water table. The fishing and hunting were extraordinary. The climate, difficult as it was for 9 months of the year, allowed crops to grow that could not survive in the harder conditions further north. And if you happened to be sitting on top of a salt dome, you had a resource beneath your feet that the rest of the region simply did not have, whether you knew it or not. Edmund McIlhenny had spent roughly 2 decades building a financial life that was rational, careful, and premised on the assumption that the economic order of the antebellum South would continue more or less indefinitely. It was not an unreasonable assumption for most of those 2 decades. The plantation economy of Louisiana was not particularly interested in questioning its own foundations. The people at the top of the system, the landowners, the bankers, the merchants, the factors who handled the cotton sales, had a collective interest in believing that what existed would continue to exist, because what existed had been very good to them. Edmund was good at his work. He understood finance with the thoroughness of someone who had learned it not as an academic exercise, but as a survival skill. He built relationships with the plantation owners whose cash flow he helped manage, whose loans he structured, whose seasonal liquidity problems he solved. He understood the rhythms of an economy built on agriculture in a way that made him genuinely useful to the people who needed someone to think clearly about money. And by doing all of this, he had arrived at 1860 as a man who had, against all reasonable odds given his starting position, accumulated a personal fortune and a professional reputation that placed him somewhere near the top of New Orleans financial society. And then, over the next 5 years, it was going to dissolve, not slowly, not gently, with a thoroughness and a finality that would have been difficult to imagine from the vantage point of 1860, when the city was still loud and commercial, and full of the energy of money moving through it at speed. The Confederate currency that replaced United States dollars in Louisiana after secession would inflate and then collapse. The banking system built around the plantation economy would follow the plantation economy itself into the chaos of war and defeat. The 5 banks that Edmund had spent 2 decades building would not survive what was coming. What would survive in the end was the land. The island sitting in the marsh, slightly elevated above the surrounding wetlands, perched on top of its impossible column of salt. The salt that had made it strategically valuable in 1862 would stop mattering in quite that way once the war ended. But the land itself, the soil, the climate, the particular combination of moisture and heat, and subtropical growing conditions was going to prove useful for something else entirely, something smaller than a war, something that would last considerably longer. At the bottom of the salt excavation in May of 1862, nobody was thinking about peppers. The Confederate supply officers counting the extracted salt by the ton were not asking themselves what else might grow on that raised piece of Louisiana marshland. Edmund McIlhenny, watching his financial world come apart from inside the New Orleans banking community, was not yet thinking about fermentation barrels or glass bottles, or the question of what happens when you mix ground chilies with salt and vinegar and patience. He was thinking about survival, about the family depending on him, about the land in Iberia Parish, and whether it was safe enough to move to, about whether the war would be shorter than it appeared. The answer to that last question would turn out to be no, significantly. But the answer to the unasked question, what do you do when everything you built is gone and all you have left is a piece of land with a geological secret, would turn out to be one of the more interesting answers in American food history. It just took a few more years of catastrophe before anyone got around to asking it. The salt dome would keep its enormous secret mostly intact. 22 million pounds was by any normal standard a staggering amount of salt. But against the backdrop of what was actually down there, a deposit that geologists would later calculate extended deeper than the tallest mountain on Earth is tall, it was barely a scratch on the surface. The Confederate extraction operation had been massive by the standards of the time. Against the scale of what the geology had provided, it was a rounding error. The island had given the Confederacy what it needed for a desperate period of wartime logistics. The island was keeping the rest for later, for something smaller and in its own way considerably more durable. But before any of that could happen, the island was going to burn, and Edmund was going to lose almost everything he had built, including the banks, including the financial reputation, including the comfortable sense that his 2 decades of careful work had placed him on solid enough ground that the future was essentially manageable. The future, as it turned out, had different ideas. The future almost always does, which is either deeply unsettling or oddly comforting depending on which side of the catastrophe you happen to be standing on at the time. The important thing to hold on to The thing that connects the young man from Hagerstown with no inheritance to the man who would eventually create something that ended up on the International Space Station is that Edmund McIlhenny had already proven once that he could build something from nothing. He had done it in New Orleans with nothing but stubbornness and an understanding of how money moved through an agricultural economy. He had done it in a city designed to keep people like him on the outside of real power, and he had done it well enough to end up 20 years later with 5 banks and a personal fortune and a social position that he had constructed entirely by hand. The question was whether he could do it a second time, not in the familiar territory of New Orleans banking, where he knew every mechanism and every relationship and every rhythm of the business, but in the unfamiliar territory of starting over, in his late 40s, with nothing but a damaged piece of land and a family that needed feeding, and a stubborn refusal to accept that what had happened was permanent. The pepper plants, quietly growing in the subtropical Louisiana soil, were already waiting for the answer. The thing about building something carefully over 20 years is that it takes roughly 20 years to build and considerably less time to destroy. The Confederate salt operation on Avery Island, which had been producing millions of pounds of salt for Southern armies, and which had briefly made the island one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate in the Western theatre of the war, attracted exactly the kind of attention you would expect from Union military commanders who understood that supply lines and resources were as important to a war effort as anything happening on a conventional battlefield. General Nathaniel P. Banks, commanding Union forces in Louisiana in the spring of 1863, was the kind of officer who paid close attention to logistics. He understood that the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies in the field depended on its ability to feed and supply them, and he understood that the salt works at Avery Island were contributing meaningfully to that ability. The solution, from his perspective, was straightforward in the way that military solutions tend to be when the objective is destruction rather than construction. In April of 1863, Union troops reached Avery Island. What they did there was efficient and thorough, 2 qualities that are generally admirable in most endeavours, and absolutely devastating when the endeavour in question involves fire and the buildings you have spent the previous year constructing. All 18 structures associated with the salt works were burned. The extraction equipment was destroyed. The processing facilities that had managed to take raw salt from the ground and turn it into a usable product at a rate of tens of millions of pounds per year were reduced to ash and scorched timber, and the kind of structural remnants that make it clear, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the people responsible were not interested in leaving anything operational behind them. It was, as acts of military destruction go, thorough. You could not accuse General Banks of doing a half-hearted job. The Avery family, who had been living on the island during the period of salt production, did not wait around to discuss the matter. They fled west into Texas, as did a significant number of prominent Louisiana families who had strong Confederate sympathies and an understandable preference for not being present when Union forces arrived to inventory their holdings. Texas in 1863 was still under Confederate control and offered the kind of refuge that Louisiana, with its major port city already in Union hands since 1862, could no longer reliably provide. It was not a comfortable situation by any reasonable standard, but it was considerably more comfortable than the available alternatives. Edmund was not, by this point, in a position that resembled the one he had occupied 3 years earlier. The 5 banks he had spent 2 decades building had not survived the economic convulsions of the war. Confederate Louisiana ran on Confederate currency, which had been inflating at a rate that reflected a government financing a major war primarily by printing money, a strategy that tends to work for a limited period and then stops working with considerable enthusiasm. By 1863, the Confederate dollar had lost a substantial portion of its original value, and the trajectory was not encouraging. Banks built around a currency in free fall, and a plantation economy being dismantled by a combination of military destruction and the systematic unravelling of the institution on which it depended were not, as financial institutions, in an ideal position. Edmund's professional world had not collapsed dramatically or suddenly. It had dissolved, steadily, and with an almost bureaucratic thoroughness, as the conditions that had made it viable were removed one by one. He ended up working as a civilian clerk attached to the Confederate military apparatus. This is the kind of career trajectory that does not appear in the authorized biographies of successful industrialists, partly because authorized biographies of successful industrialists are generally not interested in the parts of the story where the protagonist is doing administrative paperwork for an army that is in the process of losing a war. But there it was. The man who had owned 5 banks was now handling clerical duties for the military in a refugee situation in Texas, with a currency that was depreciating faster than anyone's optimism could reasonably keep up with. If Edmund found this professionally humiliating, the historical record is politely silent on the subject. He was, by all accounts, not given to public complaint, which was either admirable stoicism or a personality type that had learned very early that complaining about circumstances rarely improved them. The war ended in the spring of 1865 with the Confederate surrender, which resolved the political and military situation and left absolutely everything else in a state of extraordinary disorder. The economic structure of the South had been built on institutions and arrangements that no longer existed. The plantation system that had generated the wealth flowing through Edmund's banks had depended entirely on enslaved labour, and that labour was now free, a moral correction that was long overdue, and an economic disruption that was, for the people whose fortunes had been built on the wrong side of that system, immediate and total. Reconstruction, as the subsequent period came to be called, was the federal government's attempt to rebuild the South's social and economic foundations on a different basis. It was a complicated, contested, frequently chaotic process that satisfied almost nobody, created enormous suffering for the formerly enslaved people who had been promised meaningful freedom and were systematically denied it, and left the former Confederate states in a state of economic depression that would take decades to meaningfully resolve. Edmund returned to Avery Island in 1865 and found what you would expect to find, at a place that had served as a major military production facility, been destroyed by enemy troops, and then sat largely unoccupied for 2 years in the subtropical Louisiana climate. The plantation's agricultural operations were gone. The main house had sustained damage. The fields that had once supported sugar production were overgrown. The infrastructure of the salt operation was rubble. The economic system that had connected the island's productivity to markets and capital was no longer functioning in any recognizable form. The Confederate currency he might have saved was worth nothing. His banks were gone. His professional network, built over 2 decades in New Orleans financial society, was scattered, impoverished, or otherwise occupied with the process of trying to figure out what came next in a South that no longer operated by any of the rules it had run on before. What Edmund had, in its entirety, was the land. Specifically, he had the land that belonged to his wife's family. Avery Island was Mary Eliza's inheritance, connected to the Avery family that had held it for generations. It was not his, in the strictly legal sense, but it was what he had to work with, and a man who had arrived in New Orleans in the early 1840s with nothing but stubbornness and the willingness to learn a business from the inside out, was not entirely unfamiliar with the experience of starting from an uncomfortable position and figuring out what to do next. He had done it once. The circumstances the second time around were, if anything, worse. He was older, the resources were thinner, and there was no functioning economic system around him to plug into, even if he had known exactly what to do. But the land was there, and the salt dome was still there underneath it, and the subtropical Louisiana climate that made the island's soil enormously productive for certain kinds of plants was still very much in operation, indifferent to the political and economic disasters that had swept through the region. The pepper plants came into this story at some point during the late 1860s, which sounds like a precise enough statement until you start looking at where those particular peppers came from, at which point you discover one of the more interesting and genuinely disputed questions in the entire history of this product, a question that the company founded on those peppers has been carefully managing its official position on for over a century. To understand the dispute, you have to go back about 15 years before Edmund started growing anything on Avery Island, to a plantation called Deer Range, located in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. The man who owned Deer Range was named Maunsell White, and he was, in several important respects, a genuinely remarkable person who has been substantially underwritten by history, probably because history tends to favour the people who end up with the commercially successful product and the durable brand rather than the people who had the interesting idea first. Maunsell White was Irish-born. He had come to America as a young man and made his way to Louisiana, where he built a successful planting career and established himself as a figure of some prominence in the pre-war plantation society of the state. He was also, by most accounts, a person with an unusually active curiosity about the agricultural possibilities of the region he lived in, which in the rich subtropical soil of Louisiana meant there was a great deal to be curious about. He grew a wide variety of crops on his property, experimented with different agricultural techniques, and paid close attention to plants that might have commercial or culinary value beyond the standard cotton and sugar economy that defined most of the plantation world around him. At some point in the 1840s, Monsell White began growing a particular variety of small, intensely hot pepper on his Deer Range property. The exact origin of the peppers is not entirely clear. They may have come through trade connections with Mexico or Central America, where members of the capsicum family had been cultivated for thousands of years, or they may have arrived through the Caribbean trade networks that connected New Orleans to a wide variety of botanical material. What is clear is that White grew them, that he became genuinely interested in their culinary and possibly medicinal properties, and that he developed a sauce from them that he used, distributed to friends, and apparently discussed with some enthusiasm with people in his social circle. By 1850, references to Monsell White's pepper sauce were appearing in New Orleans newspapers. This is not an interpretation or a reconstruction. The references exist. They describe a hot condiment made from a specific variety of small red pepper grown on White's plantation, with a flavour profile and intensity that clearly impressed the people who encountered it. The sauce was already being written about as something distinctive, something worth mentioning, something that had developed a small but genuine reputation among the people who had tried it. White was, in other words, making and sharing a pepper sauce from a particular variety of Louisiana-grown chili at least 15 to 17 years before Edmund McIlhenny began the commercial enterprise that would eventually become the most recognized hot sauce in the world. The connection between Monsell White and Edmund McIlhenny, which is the part of this story that the McIlhenny Company has consistently and strenuously preferred not to discuss in its official history, comes from testimony presented in a court case in 1922, roughly 3 decades after both men had died. The case involved a legal dispute over the Tabasco trademark, and in the course of that litigation, witnesses offered statements about the origins of the pepper plants used by McIlhenny. Several of those witnesses testified that Monsell White had personally given Edmund McIlhenny pepper pods from his Deer Range plants, along with the general outlines of his method for making sauce from them. The McIlhenny Company disputes this account. They have disputed it since it was first raised publicly, and they continue to dispute it today, with a consistency that is at least impressive in its longevity, if not entirely persuasive in its reasoning. Their primary argument is a technical one. Monsell White's method for making his sauce involved boiling the peppers with vinegar and salt, while Edmund McIlhenny's process used fermentation, aging the ground peppers with salt in wooden barrels before adding vinegar. This, the company argues, represents a sufficiently different approach that McIlhenny cannot reasonably be said to have simply adopted White's recipe. He invented something distinct. This is technically accurate as far as it goes, which is to say, it is accurate about the production method while being somewhat quiet about the question of where the specific pepper variety came from, who had been growing it and making sauce from it for a decade and a half before McIlhenny started, and whether receiving the plant material and the general conceptual framework for a pepper sauce from someone qualifies as invention in any meaningful sense. The McIlhenny Company's position essentially draws a line between the raw material and the method, argues that the method is what matters, and invites you not to think too hard about the other side of that line. It is worth sitting with this question for a moment, not because it changes anything about the product or the company or the extraordinary commercial success that followed, but because it is genuinely interesting as a question about how we think about innovation and credit, and the difference between having an idea and doing something durable with it. The history of technology and commerce is full of cases where the person who receives credit for an invention was not, in the strict sense, the first person to have the relevant insight, but was the first person to develop it into something that could actually function at scale, survive commercially, and endure beyond its first iteration. Whether that makes them the inventor is a philosophical question that different people answer differently. Monsell White made a pepper sauce that people in New Orleans were writing about appreciatively in 1850. That sauce existed. It had a reputation. It was made from a specific variety of pepper that White grew on his property. And then, roughly 17 years later, Edmund McIlhenny began making a pepper sauce on Avery Island, from what appear, based on the evidence available, to have been the same variety of pepper using a different but related process, and developed it into a commercial product that survived his death, survived the deaths of his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and is today one of the most distributed food products in human history. These two things are both true. The company built on that product would rather you think of them as entirely separate things. The evidence suggests the relationship is more complicated than that. What is also true, and what the McIlhenny Company's position implicitly acknowledges whether it intends to or not, is that being first with an idea is not the same as being the person who transforms that idea into something lasting. Monsell White died in 1863 during the war, before he had any opportunity to develop his pepper sauce into anything beyond a local curiosity appreciated by the people in his immediate social circle. He had not patented his process. He had not built a commercial operation. He had made an interesting product, shared it generously, and died without doing anything to ensure its continuation. The product died with him, or at least it faded into the kind of historical footnote that only emerges when someone starts digging through old court testimony for a trademark dispute. Edmund McIlhenny, working with material that may or may not have come directly from White's plants, did something fundamentally different. He did not just make the sauce. He built a system for making it consistently, scaled it to commercial production, found customers for it, protected it legally, priced it deliberately, packaged it distinctively, and laid the groundwork for a business that would outlast him by generations. The fermentation process he developed, or arrived at through whatever combination of experimentation, borrowed knowledge, and personal insight actually produced it, created a flavor profile that was demonstrably different from a boiled sauce, more complex, more layered, with the kind of depth that comes from microbial activity transforming the raw ingredients over time. Whether this represents genius-level innovation or a clever refinement of an existing idea is, again, a question that depends on where you draw your definitional lines. What is not in dispute is that the peppers White had been growing, small, intensely red, with a heat level that put them well above most of the chili varieties familiar to American cooks of the period, were exactly the variety that eventually ended up on Avery Island. The plant itself came from somewhere in the Tabasco region of Mexico, which is where the word Tabasco eventually came to be applied to the product, though the story of how that name got applied and then fiercely defended is a later chapter in this particular history. For now, the important thing is the plant. Small, red, fiercely hot, and apparently well suited to the subtropical Louisiana growing conditions on the island. Whatever their specific provenance, they grew well in the Avery Island soil, which given the extraordinary mineralogical composition of that soil is perhaps not entirely surprising. Edmund planted his peppers sometime around 1867 or 1868, during the early years of his return to the island and his attempt to rebuild some kind of livelihood from the wreckage the war had left behind. The island was not a comfortable place to be rebuilding a life in 1867. Reconstruction Louisiana was complicated in ways that the word complicated does not adequately capture. Politically contested, economically depressed, socially in the middle of a transformation that was necessary and long overdue, and yet being resisted at every level by the people who had benefited from what it was replacing. The infrastructure of the plantation economy was gone. The labor system it had depended on was gone. The credit structures that had connected the plantations to capital were in disarray. New Orleans, the commercial center that had given Edmund his banking career, was still functioning but was a shadow of its pre-war self, cut off from the cotton-fueled prosperity that had made it one of the wealthiest cities in North America. Against this backdrop, the image of a man in his mid-40s planting peppers in a field on a swampy Louisiana island might seem modest to the point of being almost symbolic. And perhaps it was symbolic in some sense, a deliberate reduction of scale, a return to something material and immediate after years of dealing with the abstract instruments of finance. Edmund had spent his career working with currency, credit, debt, interest, the infrastructure of money, the mechanisms by which real assets were converted into movable value. Now he was growing things in dirt. The gap between those two activities is large enough to contain several different life philosophies. He was also, presumably, dealing with the practical challenges of making anything grow productively on land that had not been actively farmed for several years. On an island whose agricultural workforce had been dispersed by the war and its aftermath, in a regional economy that offered very limited markets and very limited access to the kind of capital investment that might have accelerated recovery. The peppers were not the only thing growing on the island. Edmund was attempting to rebuild the agricultural operation more broadly, but they were clearly the thing that he focused on with particular attention, probably because they were producing something with commercial potential even in very small quantities, and probably because the flavour they produced when processed properly was remarkable enough to suggest that people would actually pay money for it. The sauce he began developing from the peppers was not, by any account, an immediate accident of inspiration. It was an iterative process, the kind of repeated experimentation that you do when you have a raw ingredient that has obvious potential, and you are working through the question of how to express that potential in a stable, transferable product. He tried different combinations of pepper and salt. He tried different proportions. The clone bottles, in their way, were exactly right for the product. Small, elegant, a little unusual in the context of what you were used to seeing sauce sold in. They gave the product a visual distinctiveness that mattered commercially even at this early stage. They made the sauce look like something special rather than something bulk, something with personality rather than something generic. Edmund sealed them with green wax and attached a small wooden applicator, a tiny stopper that doubled as a spreading tool, which added to the sense that this was a product designed with some thought for the experience of using it. For a man who had spent his career in banking, where presentation and the construction of confidence were understood to be as important as the underlying substance, this instinct for packaging was perhaps not surprising. He understood that what a product looked like, how it was presented, what it communicated about itself before anyone had tasted it, was part of the commercial proposition. The image of children being recruited from their schoolwork to help stick labels on bottles of hot sauce is either charming or alarming depending on your perspective on child labour in the 1870s, and the honest answer is that it was probably both. It was also, in its way, a sign of something important about how Edmund understood the business he was building. He was not treating it as a separate commercial enterprise distinct from the family. He was building a family enterprise, one in which the distinction between the business and the people running it was essentially non-existent. This would turn out to have consequences, both positive and complicated, that echoed across generations. The return to zero that the war had imposed on Edmund was, in retrospect, an extraordinary piece of forced redesign. The banking career he had built over 20 years in New Orleans was gone. The financial instruments he had been expert in were gone. The social and economic architecture that had made all of it possible was gone. What remained was a piece of land, a labour-intensive and somewhat experimental agricultural product, and the habits of mind he had developed over decades of building something from nothing. The attention to how things were presented, the understanding of credit and pricing and distribution, the willingness to do unglamorous work in service of a larger objective that was not yet visible to anyone else. He applied all of those habits to something that had seemed, at the beginning, like a temporary measure, a way of generating some income from the land while he figured out what came next. A product he would sell for a while until something better appeared. The something better never appeared. Or rather, the something better turned out to be exactly what he was already doing. By the early 1870s, with a patent secured and orders coming in from beyond the Gulf Coast, it was becoming clear that the temporary measure was developing a life of its own. The question was no longer whether the sauce could sustain the family. The question was becoming how large it could grow, and how you protected something this small and this specific from the inevitable attempts by other people to copy it, compete with it, or simply take the name and attach it to something inferior. That question, the question of the name and what it meant and who had the right to use it, was about to become the central legal and commercial challenge of the next several decades. Edmund McIlhenny died in 1890, and the battles that followed his death over the word Tabasco, over what it referred to, who owned it, and whether it could be used by anyone making any kind of pepper product, or was the exclusive property of one family on one island in Louisiana, were going to be conducted with a ferocity and a duration that, frankly, suggests the McIlhenny family had inherited some of the Irish stubbornness that had driven Edmund south from Maryland half a century earlier. But that is, as they say, the next part of the story. What matters at this moment is the shape of what had been built by the early 1870s. Not yet an empire, not yet a global product, but something recognizable as the foundation of one. A man who had lost everything had planted peppers in Louisiana soil, fermented them with island salt, bottled the result in old cologne bottles, and found that people were willing to pay for it. The sauce that Monsell White had been making 15 years earlier on his Deer Range plantation had never escaped the boundaries of polite New Orleans society. Edmund's version was slowly, and then not so slowly, beginning to travel. Whether this represents invention or refinement or the strategic exploitation of someone else's groundwork is a question that reasonable people can disagree about, and apparently have been disagreeing about for over 100 years. What is not in question is the outcome. One man had an interesting idea and kept it to himself, or at least kept it within the circle of his immediate social world. Another man built a system around a similar idea and made it permanent. History, with its characteristic indifference to philosophical nuance, has credited the second man with the creation and left the first man to the footnotes. Whether that is fair is above the pay grade of this particular account. But understanding that the footnote exists and what it contains seems like the minimum required to understand what was actually built and how, and on what foundations. The pepper plants grew, the bottles filled, the sauce travelled further from the island with each passing year. The man who had arrived in New Orleans with nothing but stubbornness and ended up with 5 banks and then nothing again, and then a swampy island and some fermenting peppers was, by the end of his life, in the process of creating something that would outlast not just him, but everyone he would ever know. He did not know this. He probably could not have imagined it. But the process was already in motion, with the particular slow momentum of something that has found the exact conditions it needs to grow. There is something almost philosophical about the way the most enduring products in history tend to involve the fewest possible ingredients. Not because simplicity is inherently virtuous, though people who sell things like to imply that it is, but because simplicity in a product that needs to survive shipping, storage, variable temperatures, and the general indignities of 19th century American commerce is a genuine competitive advantage. Every additional ingredient is another thing that can go wrong, another variable that behaves differently in summer than in winter, another element that requires sourcing and quality control, and the kind of ongoing logistical attention that a one-man operation on a remote Louisiana island is not particularly well positioned to provide. Edmund McIlhenny, whether through deliberate calculation or through the practical wisdom of someone working with limited resources, arrived at 3 ingredients, just 3: peppers, salt, and vinegar. The whole enterprise, the entire commercial and cultural phenomenon that followed, rested on exactly those 3 things combined in a specific way and in a specific sequence. It is, when you think about it, almost aggressively simple, which is probably why it worked. The peppers were the foundation, obviously, but the peppers alone would have produced something that spoiled quickly, travelled poorly, and was interesting to exactly the community of people who happened to be standing nearby when it was fresh. The transformation from raw ingredient to stable commercial product required the other 2 elements, and the way Edmund combined them was not arbitrary. The process he had worked out through whatever combination of experimentation and knowledge he had accumulated was a genuine piece of practical food science, even if the science of exactly what was happening at the microbial level would not have been fully understood by most people working in kitchens or on farms in 1868. What Edmund knew was empirical, that doing things in a certain order with certain proportions over a certain amount of time produced a result that was dramatically better than doing them differently. The why was less important than the what, which is how most culinary knowledge actually operates. The sequence began with the harvest. The Tabasco peppers, small and intensely red at full ripeness, were picked at the precise moment when their colour and heat and flavour were at their peak. Not before, when the capsaicin content had not fully developed, and not after, when the flesh began to soften and the flavour started to shift in ways that would show up in the finished product. Achieving that timing requires paying attention to a specific plant in a specific field in a specific climate, which is the kind of thing that sounds straightforward until you try to do it at scale. Edmund was working with a relatively small planting at this early stage, which made the timing easier to manage, but it also meant that the entire year's commercial potential was concentrated in a narrow harvest window. Miss it, and you waited another year. There was a practical urgency to the harvest season that a banker might not have experienced in quite the same way, and which probably clarified Edmund's thinking about the relationship between the natural world and the commercial calendar. The harvested peppers were ground, which in 1868 meant physical labour with implements that bore no resemblance to the industrial processing equipment that would eventually handle the same task at vastly larger volumes. The ground pepper mash was then combined with salt from the island. The same salt dome that had made Avery Island strategically important during the war was now providing the mineral backbone of a condiment, which represents a fairly dramatic repurposing of a geological feature by any reasonable measure. The proportion of salt to pepper mash was specific and consistent, because salt in fermentation is not just a seasoning, it is a selective filter. The right concentration of salt suppresses the growth of undesirable microorganisms while creating conditions that favour the lactic acid bacteria responsible for fermentation, which is the same basic principle behind sauerkraut and pickles and any number of other preserved foods that humans across many cultures had figured out through long experience without necessarily understanding the chemistry involved. The salted mash went into wooden barrels, white oak barrels, which had their own contribution to make to the flavour development over the aging period. White oak is permeable enough to allow a small amount of oxygen exchange, which matters for the microbial process happening inside, and it contributes compounds from the wood itself that interact with the fermenting mash in ways that add complexity to the final flavour. Whether Edmund understood these mechanisms in detail is unclear, but he understood the outcome. Barrels produced a better result than alternative containers, and white oak barrels produced a better result than other types. These are the kinds of empirical truths that accumulate in any craft process through iteration, through noticing that one approach works better than another without necessarily being able to explain exactly why, and then committing to the approach that works. The barrels were sealed and left to age. The 30-day period that the earliest batches required would eventually be extended considerably as Edmund refined his understanding of what the fermentation was doing and what a longer aging time added to the result. But in the initial commercial batches, a month was the standard, and a month in the subtropical Louisiana climate with its heat and humidity drove the fermentation with considerable enthusiasm. The inside of those barrels was a busy place microbiologically speaking, though describing it that way does not necessarily make the sauce sound more appetizing. The end result, however, was something that had transformed from raw ground pepper and salt into a mash with a developed, complex, somewhat funky depth that bore only a passing resemblance to the original ingredients. Fermentation does this. It takes simple inputs and produces complex outputs, converting straightforward agricultural materials into something that has earned its flavour profile through time and microbial activity, rather than simply being the sum of its parts. After fermentation, the vinegar was introduced. This step was not just a finishing touch, it was chemically important in several ways simultaneously. The acidity of the vinegar extended the shelf life of the finished sauce by creating an environment that further inhibited the growth of spoilage organisms. It adjusted the flavour balance, cutting through the richness of the fermented mash with a sharpness that kept the sauce from being simply hot, and instead made it hot and bright, two qualities that work very differently on the palate. And it affected the consistency, thinning the mash to a pourable liquid that would behave appropriately in a bottle. The type of vinegar Edmund used was distilled white vinegar, not the more complex wine vinegars that might have been available in a well-stocked kitchen, but a clean neutral acidity that let the pepper flavour dominate without adding another layer of competing flavour. This is the right choice for a product that is supposed to taste like concentrated pepper, rather than like a salad dressing. It is the kind of specific, defensible decision that separates a product with a clear identity from one that is generically acceptable. The blending of the vinegar into the fermented mash was followed by straining, removing the spent pepper seeds and skin that had given up their contribution to the fermentation and were no longer needed in the finished product. What remained after straining was a smooth, intensely red-orange liquid, with a consistency thin enough to shake out of a bottle and concentrated enough that a few drops was sufficient to season a serving of food. The colour alone was arresting. The particular orange-red of Tabasco peppers, intensified by fermentation, was unlike anything else in the condiment market of the period. In an era before commercial food colouring had become a normal part of processed food, that colour was entirely natural and entirely striking. It looked like something worth paying attention to, which in a market where a customer is deciding between unfamiliar products on a grocer's shelf matters considerably. The bottles were old cologne bottles. The specific variety was a small elongated glass flask that had originally been designed for fragrance products, elegant in a modest way, with proportions that happened to suit a table condiment rather well. Small enough to be handled easily, tall enough to look purposeful, with a narrow neck that allowed the user to apply the sauce in small quantities rather than accidentally drowning their food in it. Edmund had not designed these bottles. He was using them because they were available in quantity, because post-war Louisiana was a place where recycling containers was a normal economic behavior rather than an environmental statement, and because, as it happened, they were exactly the right thing for what he needed. The green wax seal was deliberate. Edmund had a number of sealing options available to him, and he chose green wax, which communicates something specific that most other colours do not: freshness, botanical origin, the suggestion of something from the natural world rather than the factory. Whether he thought through this symbolism consciously or simply liked the way it looked is not documented anywhere, but the effect was real. A small bottle of intense red liquid sealed with bright green wax was a distinctive visual object that stood out against the more utilitarian packaging of most condiments of the period. It looked like it had been made by someone who cared about what it looked like, which in 1869 was not a standard expectation for a table sauce. Most condiments of the era were packaged with all the visual enthusiasm of a tax document. The wooden applicator that came attached to the bottle added another layer of intentionality to the product's design. It was a small, flat-bottomed stopper made of wood, thin enough to use as a spreading tool, functional as a closure, and suggestive of a certain precision in how the product was meant to be used. You did not pour Tabasco sauce, you applied it. This is a subtle distinction with real commercial implications, because it positioned the product as something for careful, deliberate use rather than something to slosh onto food indiscriminately. It suggested that the contents were concentrated and powerful and deserved respect, which they were and did. The applicator also meant that the sauce was being sold as an experience as much as a product. The ritual of opening the bottle, dipping the applicator, touching it to the food, which is a level of product theatre that, again, most condiment manufacturers of 1869 were not particularly focused on. The pricing at $1 per bottle was audacious. In 1869, a dollar represented meaningful money for a working family. It was roughly equivalent to a day's wages for many labourers, and spending it on a small bottle of hot sauce required some confidence in the value you were going to receive. Edmund was not pricing his product as a basic commodity. He was pricing it as something special, something premium, something that belonged on tables that aspired to a certain quality of experience. This was either a marketing decision of genuine sophistication or an optimistic guess about what the market would bear. The evidence that he got it right is in the orders that came back after those first 658 bottles reached the Gulf Coast grocers. People tried it, paid $1 for it, and then apparently wanted more of it, which is the most straightforward possible validation of a pricing decision. The Gulf Coast market that received those first bottles was, in 1869, a region still working through the economic disruption of Reconstruction, still finding its commercial footing after the destruction of the war. New Orleans remained the major commercial hub but was operating at reduced capacity compared to its pre-war peak. The smaller ports and towns along the Mississippi and the Gulf offered markets that were modest in scale, but geographically distributed in ways that meant a product could develop a regional following without depending entirely on any single city. Edmund knew these markets from his banking career. He had spent 2 decades managing the financial relationships between New Orleans capital and the agricultural communities along the bayous and coast, and he understood where goods moved and how they moved, and what kind of product a grocer in a given community might be able to sell. He was applying supply chain knowledge he had developed in finance to the logistics of a condiment business, which is not a transition that most people would have thought to make, but which turned out to be a significant competitive advantage. The grocers who stocked those first bottles were the distribution network of their era, not in the modern sense of a managed, contracted supply chain, but in the older sense of individual merchants who made individual decisions about what to carry based on their own judgment of what their particular customers wanted. If a grocer in a small Louisiana town stocked a product and it sold, he reordered it. If it sat on the shelf, he did not. The feedback mechanism was direct and not particularly subtle. Edmund's product did not sit on shelves, or at least not for long. The reorders came. The geographic footprint of the product began to expand slowly at first, and then with increasing momentum as word moved through the networks of commerce and cooking that connected the communities of the Gulf South. The scale of the early operation bears some consideration, because it is easy to project backward from the eventual size of the enterprise, and imagine that Edmund was building something that felt, even in its early stages, like the beginning of a major commercial venture. He was not. He was running a small agricultural processing operation on an island, with his family providing a significant portion of the labour, in a region that was economically depressed, in a period when the infrastructure of commerce was still being rebuilt after years of destruction. The 658 bottles of 1869 were followed by larger batches in subsequent years, but growth was measured in hundreds and then thousands of cases rather than millions. The operation was expanding, but it was expanding at the pace of a small family business in a recovering regional economy, not at the pace of an industrial manufacturer with access to capital and distribution infrastructure. Marigold's recollections of being pulled from school when large orders arrived capture something essential about the scale and character of the enterprise in its early years. There was no separation between the business and the household, no professional workforce showing up at a designated production facility to do designated jobs according to a structured schedule. When there was work to be done, when peppers needed processing, when barrels needed monitoring, when bottles needed filling and labeling and sealing, the family did it. Marigold applied labels, other family members did other tasks. Edmund supervised and directed and made the decisions that needed making, while also doing a substantial portion of the physical work himself. This is not unusual for a small family enterprise in the 1870s, but it is worth noting as a contrast to the way the company would eventually come to operate, and as context for understanding why the family's sense of ownership of the product was so deep and so persistent. This was not an investment. This was work they had done with their own hands, in their own home, as a survival strategy after everything else had failed. You do not sell that easily, and you do not let other people make decisions about it easily either. The patent obtained in 1870 was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential pieces of paper in the history of American food commerce, though it would not have looked that way at the time. Patents are routine commercial instruments, a standard mechanism for establishing priority and protecting a process from imitation, and in 1870 nobody could have foreseen that the specific protection being sought would eventually matter to hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The language of the application described Edmund's process as novel and distinctive, which it was by the specific technical criteria that patent law applies, and defined the product by its method of production and its main ingredient rather than by its exact formulation. This was the correct approach from a legal standpoint, because formulations are easy to vary slightly and then argue do not infringe a protected recipe, while a distinctive process is considerably harder to design around without producing something meaningfully different. The word Tabasco appears in the patent application in a way that is worth paying close attention to, because it establishes, in a legal document, the connection between that specific word and that specific product at an early stage in the product's commercial history. The pepper variety had been called Tabasco for reasons connected to its geographic origin in the Mexican state of the same name, and the name had travelled with the plant through whatever chain of botanical commerce had brought it to Louisiana. Edmund did not invent the word, but he was in the process of attaching it, through commerce and then through legal protection, to a specific product made by a specific process in a specific place. The word was common enough in 1870 that competitors would later argue it was simply a descriptive term for a type of pepper, and could not be owned by anyone. The family would argue, with the help of several decades of litigation and a series of legal victories, that it had become something quite different, a brand identifier, a trademark, a word that meant not just a type of pepper, but a specific product from a specific source. That argument was not settled quickly or easily, but it began, in a quiet way, with the language of a patent application filed in 1870 by a man in his late 40s who was trying to protect the most commercially promising thing he had managed to build in the 5 years since the war had taken everything else. The physical mechanics of scaling up from a few hundred bottles to a few thousand involved solving a series of small but real practical problems that are invisible in retrospect because the solutions became obvious only after someone had worked them out. Sourcing enough glass bottles of consistent size and quality required relationships with suppliers that did not exist in southern Louisiana in 1870. The cologne bottle solution had worked for the first batches but was not a long-term answer. You cannot build a growing condiment business on a supply of used fragrance containers, not because there is anything wrong with it philosophically, but because the supply is unpredictable and the sizes vary in ways that make consistent packaging difficult. Edmund needed a reliable bottle supply, which meant establishing relationships with glass manufacturers in other parts of the country, which meant correspondence and credit arrangements, and the logistical coordination of shipping fragile glass containers through the unreliable transportation networks of the post-war South. The barrel supply for fermentation was another ongoing logistics problem. White oak barrels were used for various purposes in the 19th century economy, whiskey aging being the most prominent, which meant there was a market for them and sources of supply, but also competition for them and variability in their condition. A barrel that had previously held something with a strong flavour could contribute unwanted notes to the fermenting pepper mash inside it. Edmund needed barrels with specific histories or newly made barrels from reliable coopers, and he needed them in quantities that grew as production grew. This is the kind of operational detail that gets buried in the romantic narrative of entrepreneurial creation. The person who made the thing also had to source the containers that held the thing, the barrels that aged the thing, the vinegar that finished the thing, the labels that identified the thing, and the distribution relationships that moved the thing to people who might buy it. There is no version of building a food business in 1870 that does not involve an enormous amount of logistics. The label itself was a piece of commercial communication that Edmund took seriously from the beginning. The earliest label designs were simple: the product name, the producer's name, the island's name as a provenance marker. But they were not casual. The choice of what to put on a label and how to arrange it and what typeface to use and how much space to give each element reflects a set of decisions about what the product is communicating to a potential buyer who has never encountered it before. Edmund wanted buyers to know where it came from, specifically from a named place on a named island, because provenance was part of the value proposition. This was not a generic pepper sauce from an anonymous manufacturer. It was a specific product from a specific family in a specific location, and the label was designed to make that clear in the 3 or 4 seconds a potential customer spent looking at a shelf before making a decision. The response of the Gulf Coast market to the product told Edmund something important about what he had made. Hot sauces and pepper condiments were not unknown in the South in 1869. The region had a culinary tradition that appreciated and used chile peppers in various forms, and there were other commercial condiments available that offered some degree of heat. What distinguished Edmund's product in the market was not simply that it was spicy, but that it was spicy in a particular way, with a particular flavour profile developed through fermentation that made it distinctively complex compared to alternatives, and that it was packaged and priced in a way that communicated quality and intentionality. People who tried it did not reach for it as a cheaper version of something else they already bought. They reached for it as something that stood on its own, as a product with a specific flavour that nothing else on the shelf replicated. This is the commercial foundation that made everything that followed possible. Not a revolutionary technology, not a dramatic innovation, not a product that nobody had ever imagined before. A specific combination of 3 simple ingredients, prepared in a specific way developed through careful iteration, packaged with attention to presentation, priced at a level that reflected confidence in its distinctiveness, and sold into a market where it had no direct equivalent. The 658 bottles of 1869 are famous now because of what came after them, but they would have been equally significant as a starting point even if the story had stayed considerably smaller. They represented proof that the method worked, that the market responded, that a man who had arrived at the lowest point of his life with nothing but land and stubbornness had found something real in those 3 ingredients that other people were willing to pay for. Edmund spent the early 1870s managing the growth of the operation, while simultaneously dealing with the ongoing challenges of living and working in Reconstruction Louisiana. The political environment was unstable in ways that affected commerce and infrastructure, and the general reliability of systems that a growing business needed to function. Shipping was inconsistent. Credit was difficult. The economic recovery of the region was real but uneven, and the markets Edmund was selling into were markets composed of people who were also navigating an uncertain economic environment. The product survived all of this, not because Edmund had built a fortress of a business, but because the product itself was good enough that people with limited discretionary spending chose to spend some of it on a small bottle of hot sauce. That is, ultimately, the most straightforward test any commercial product can pass, and Tabasco was passing it consistently. The family involvement that Marigold's memories described was not incidental to the product's success. It was structural to it. The sauce was made by people who had skin in the game in the most literal possible sense. People for whom the quality and consistency of every batch was not a performance metric, but a direct reflection of their own livelihoods and reputations. When Edmund pulled his daughter from school to apply labels, He was not being casual about her education. He was operating with the priorities of someone building something under pressure. Someone for whom the difference between a good week and a bad week was measured in bottles filled and orders sent. That urgency produced a kind of attention to the product that is difficult to replicate once a business grows large enough to hire strangers to do the work. It was the urgency of people who had already lost everything once, and were determined, with a thoroughness born of experience, not to lose it again. By the mid-1870s, the product had found enough of a foothold in the Gulf Coast market to suggest that it was going to survive. Not thrive in any dramatic sense, not yet. The volumes were still modest, the geographic reach still relatively limited, the operation still unmistakably a small family enterprise rather than a commercial manufacturer. But it was generating consistent income, and consistent income in post-war Louisiana was not something to take lightly. Edmund had demonstrated to his own satisfaction, and to the satisfaction of anyone watching, that the three ingredients could sustain a business. The clone bottles were being replaced by purpose-made glass bottles of a consistent design. The labels were becoming more refined. The distribution relationships were extending further up the coast and beginning to reach beyond the immediate Gulf region. Edmund himself was aging. He had been in his mid-40s when he planted the first peppers, which in 1868 was not young in any era's understanding of the term, and the years of building the business had not been easy years. He had spent 2 decades building a banking career, lost it entirely to the war, spent several years as a refugee and a clerk, and then spent the better part of a decade constructing something new from agricultural raw materials on an island that was still recovering from military destruction. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, he was moving through his 60s, and the question of what happened to the business after him was not an abstract one. He had children who were involved in the operation. He had a structure, however informal, of family participation that could, if the will was there, continue after his death. Whether it would, and what shape it would take, and whether the next generation had the same combination of stubbornness and practical intelligence and unwillingness to accept defeat that had carried Edmund from a Maryland town with no inheritance to a bottle of hot sauce in virtually every grocery store on the Gulf Coast. These were questions that would get answered in the years after 1890, when Edmund died and the enterprise he had built passed to his sons. What he left them was deceptively simple: a recipe, a process, a name, a market, and the institutional knowledge of how to make something consistently good from 3 ingredients in a specific sequence in barrels on an island in Louisiana. That is not nothing. In fact, it is everything, though it would take the next several decades of litigation, competition, family politics, and expanding markets to prove it. The 3 ingredients were still the same ones Edmund had started with. The bottles had changed, the scale had changed, the reach was changing. The foundations were exactly where Edmund had laid them, which is to say buried in the marshy Louisiana soil of an island that most of the people who used the product would never visit, and could not have located on a map. The source had found its form. What it had not yet found was the argument about its name, an argument that was coming with considerable force and considerable legal creativity, and that would determine whether what Edmund built was the foundation of a dynasty, or merely the beginning of a product category that anyone could enter with a bottle and a label, and the word Tabasco printed on it in whatever typeface they preferred. But before we get to the lawyers, and there will be a significant number of lawyers, in a quantity that would have surprised even Edmund, who had spent his career in banking and was not unfamiliar with legal complexity, it is worth holding for a moment on the specific physical object that was travelling away from Avery Island in increasing numbers through the 1870s and into the 1880s. Small glass bottle, red-orange liquid, thin enough to pour but concentrated enough to mean it, a label that said where it came from and who made it, a colour that was genuinely unlike anything else on the shelf, a price that said this is not a generic item, an applicator that said use this carefully, a little goes a long way. That combination of physical and commercial decisions, the bottle shape, the colour, the label, the price, the applicator, added up to a product identity that was unusually coherent for a small family operation in the 1870s. Edmund had never formally studied marketing. He had never taken a course in brand development or consumer psychology or retail positioning. What he had, instead, was 2 decades of experience in banking, where the difference between a financial instrument that inspired confidence and one that did not was the difference between success and failure. and where presentation and specificity and the careful management of what a product communicated about itself were professional fundamentals rather than nice-to-haves. He applied all of that instinct to a bottle of hot sauce, and the result was a product that looked and felt like something that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing, even when the someone was working in a farmhouse on a Louisiana island with family members recruited from school to help with the labeling. There is also something worth saying about what those first buyers were actually purchasing when they bought a bottle in 1869 or 1872 or 1876. They were not just buying heat. Louisiana cuisine, and Southern cooking more broadly, had been incorporating various forms of chili pepper flavor for generations. Heat in food was not a novelty. What Edmund's sauce offered was a specific, reliable, consistent version of that heat. The same flavor profile, the same intensity, the same balance of pepper and acid every time you bought a bottle. In a period when most food was either grown at home or purchased from sources where quality varied enormously, consistency was genuinely valuable. You knew exactly what you were getting. You knew exactly how much to use. You could reproduce the result you liked every time you cooked, which is a kind of reliability that sounds obvious now, but was not something the condiment market of 1869 was systematically delivering. This consistency came directly from the process Edmund had developed. Fermentation, properly managed, is remarkably reproducible. The same strain of lactic acid bacteria, the same temperature range, the same salt concentration, the same pepper variety harvested at the same ripeness, produce the same result with a reliability that purely agricultural products, subject to all the variability of weather and soil and season, cannot match. Edmund had essentially invented a controlled biological process for producing a consistent flavor, without knowing the microbiological vocabulary that would eventually be used to describe what he was doing. He was making fermented food with the empirical understanding of a craftsman, rather than the scientific vocabulary of a food technologist, but the outcome was identical, a product that tasted the same in July as it did in January, in New Orleans as it did in Mobile, in the 100th bottle as it did in the first. That reliability accumulated over years and then decades into something that is almost impossible to manufacture intentionally, but that represents the most durable form of commercial value: habit. People who grew up cooking with a particular flavor in their kitchens did not switch to alternatives casually. Their children grew up with the same flavor and incorporated it into their own cooking without thinking about it consciously. The product became part of the sensory vocabulary of the kitchen in ways that made replacing it feel vaguely wrong. The way switching from a long-time staple ingredient to a cheaper alternative always carries a low-level sense of compromise. Edmund did not design this mechanism deliberately, but the mechanism was real, and it was accumulating with every bottle that left the island and every meal that was seasoned with the contents. By the time Edmund's sons inherited the business in the 1890s, they were not inheriting a recipe and some barrels. They were inheriting a market relationship that had been built one bottle at a time over roughly 20 years, a relationship founded on consistency and specificity, and the particular flavor profile that the Avery Island fermentation process produced. They were also inheriting a name, Tabasco, that was going to require significant defending against people who wanted to use it for products that had no connection to Avery Island, no connection to the McIlhenny process, and no particular interest in the difference between the original and their version. The defense of that name would define the next 30 years of the company's history, and it would be conducted with a legal tenacity that suggested Edmund's sons had inherited his stubbornness, along with his barrels. Edmund McIlhenny died in November of 1890 at the age of 67, having spent the last 22 years of his life converting peppers, salt, and vinegar into one of the more recognizable condiments on the Gulf Coast. He had not, by most accounts, anticipated that the product would outlast him by generations. He had not written about it in his private correspondence as though it were a legacy. He had not treated it, in the way that founders of great enterprises are sometimes portrayed in retrospect, as though he knew from the beginning that he was building something enormous. He had treated it the way a practical man treats a practical solution to a practical problem, with care and consistency, and the professional standards he had developed across an entirely different career, applied to something that happened to involve fermented peppers instead of promissory notes. What he left behind when he died was a product with a regional market, a family with a clear understanding of how to make it, a patent that had been legally useful for 20 years, and a name, that specific word, Tabasco, printed on every bottle and associated in the minds of Gulf Coast consumers with one specific product from one specific island that was about to become the most contested real estate in American food law for the next 3 decades. The battles that followed Edmund's death were not, in the end, primarily about the source. They were about a word, about whether a word that had previously described a type of pepper could be converted, through commercial use and legal argument and sheer institutional determination, into something that belonged exclusively to one family in Louisiana. The answer, it turned out, was yes. But getting there required a campaign of litigation that makes the average business dispute look positively restrained. The first problem, which arrived with the punctuality of all first problems, was that Edmund had spent 20 years training people in how to make Tabasco pepper sauce. This is not a complaint. You cannot operate a growing food business without a workforce, and a workforce requires training, and training creates people who understand the production process in detail. It is simply a fact that the knowledge of how to grow the peppers, ferment the mash, and bottle the result was not, by 1890, limited to the McElhenney family. A number of people who had worked on the island over the years understood the basics of the operation well enough to replicate it. In a world without effective non-compete agreements, and in a region where the pepper variety itself grew readily in the local climate, this created a vulnerability that Edmund had, apparently, not fully addressed before his death. The first public breach arrived in the form of a former employee who had spent time working on the island's pepper operation, and who departed with something he was not supposed to take with him: seeds. Specifically, Tabasco pepper seeds, which in the context of the 1890s condiment market were not just agricultural material, but the literal biological foundation of the McElhenney product. The Tabasco pepper variety was, at this stage, not commercially available through standard agricultural supply channels in a way that allowed someone to simply purchase and plant it without any connection to the original source. It was grown on Avery Island, it had been grown there since Edmund planted his first crop, and the seeds were, from the McElhenney family's perspective, part of the proprietary foundation of their enterprise. Taking them and using them to launch a competing product was not a legally complicated act to characterize. It was straightforward appropriation, which is a polite way of saying the former employee had essentially pocketed the keys to the operation on his way out the door. He launched his own hot sauce production, using the stolen plant material, and brought his product to market under the general umbrella of Tabasco pepper sauce, because that, after all, was what the peppers were called, and the name described the ingredient accurately. Whether he thought the McElhenney family would simply accept this situation is unclear from the historical record. What is clear is that they did not. The family, now operating the business through Edmund's sons, was not in the temperament of people who shrug at this kind of thing and move on. They were in the temperament of people who had survived a war, started over from nothing, built something by hand over 20 years, and were constitutionally disinclined to allow someone who had stolen their seed stock to use their commercial name without a fight. The litigation that followed was the opening round of what would become a multi-decade legal campaign, and while the specifics of any individual case were often technical and procedural in ways that make them difficult to make cinematically engaging, the cumulative effect was significant. Every case the family won established another precedent. Every precedent made the next case marginally easier. The more strategically interesting challenger, the one whose case had implications beyond a single individual's act of appropriation, came in the form of Cornet Moss and Company, a firm based in New Iberia, which is a town in Iberia Parish, Louisiana, located near enough to Avery Island that the local geography and the local pepper-growing climate were familiar factors. New Iberia was in the heart of the region, where the Tabasco pepper grew readily. It was also home to a commercial community that had observed the McElhenney operation developing over the years, and that had drawn certain obvious conclusions about the market potential of a commercial hot sauce with a regional and increasingly national market. Cornet Moss launched a product called Green Heart Tabasco Sauce, which was exactly as blatant a use of the protected name as it sounds, and which was accompanied by the legal argument that Tabasco was a generic term describing a type of pepper, and therefore could not be owned by any single producer as a trademark. This argument was not frivolous. It was, in fact, legally coherent in a way that required serious engagement rather than dismissal. The word Tabasco had for decades been used in botanical and agricultural contexts to describe a specific variety of capsicum pepper. Newspaper references to Tabasco peppers, like the ones from 1850 that described Maunsell-White's experiments, used the word as a descriptive noun, not as a brand identifier. The peppers were grown by multiple farmers across the Louisiana region. The word appeared in horticultural catalogues without trademark attribution. If Tabasco simply meant a type of pepper, then making a sauce from Tabasco peppers and calling it Tabasco sauce was no more infringement than calling ketchup tomato sauce. You were describing what was in the bottle accurately, using the standard descriptive vocabulary for the ingredient, and no one company could claim exclusive rights to the name of an agricultural variety that anyone could grow. The McIlhenny family's counter-argument was that the word Tabasco had, through 20-plus years of consistent commercial use on a specific branded product, acquired a secondary meaning in the minds of consumers that went beyond its descriptive agricultural sense. This is a recognized legal concept called acquired distinctiveness, or secondary meaning, the idea that a word or phrase can start out as descriptive but become, through sustained commercial use, primarily associated in consumer consciousness with a specific source rather than the general category. Aspirin was originally a trademark that became generic because it was allowed to. Escalator was a trademark. Zipper was a trademark. All of them lost their protected status because their owners failed to enforce them consistently, allowing them to drift into generic usage. The McIlhenny family was, consciously or not, fighting to prevent exactly that drift from happening to their word. The argument had to be made in court repeatedly, against opponents who were motivated and reasonably well-resourced, and who had a genuinely plausible legal theory on their side. Winning it required demonstrating, through evidence and argument, that consumers encountering the word Tabasco on a bottle of hot sauce understood it to mean specifically the McIlhenny product, rather than any hot sauce made from Tabasco peppers. This kind of evidence is not obvious to gather in the 1890s. There were no consumer surveys in the modern sense, no systematic market research, no mechanism for directly measuring brand association in consumer psychology. The family had to build their case through commercial records, distribution data, correspondence, the testimony of retailers and consumers, and the accumulated documentary record of 20 years of consistent branded use of the specific word on a specific product from a specific source. Edmund's sons, particularly John Avery McIlhenny and Edward Avery McIlhenny, who took on the management of the company after their father's death, were the people primarily responsible for conducting this campaign. They were, in temperament and background, considerably more energetic and outwardly assertive than their father had been, which served the litigation strategy well. Edmund had been a careful, methodical builder, the kind of person who made things last by attending to details and maintaining standards. His sons were more expansive, more interested in the larger stage, more willing to pursue conflict aggressively when they believed they were in the right. These qualities, which could cause complications in other contexts, were precisely what the trademark defense required. You do not win 3 decades of litigation through restraint. The Cornet-Moss case and its successors were not quick resolutions. Trademark litigation in the late 19th and early 20th century moved at a pace that would make modern commercial litigants feel relatively lucky about the speed of contemporary court proceedings, which is saying something given that nobody describes modern trademark litigation as rapid. Cases were filed, argued, appealed, remanded, retried, and appealed again on timelines that stretched across years and sometimes across decades. The legal fees accumulated. The executive time consumed in managing the litigation was substantial. For a family business operating a condiment manufacturing operation on a Louisiana island, maintaining this kind of sustained legal campaign required both financial resources and institutional commitment that went well beyond what most small food companies of the era would have considered practical. The McIlhenny family maintained both. Partly this was because the commercial stakes were real. Losing the trademark would have meant losing the only legal protection distinguishing their product from any competitor who wanted to use the same name. Partly it was because the family had a particular relationship with the concept of ownership that was, by this point, deeply personal. The sauce was not a product they had invested in. It was a product they had built with their hands, starting from a situation of complete financial devastation, and it carried the weight of that origin in the way that things built under pressure always do. You fight for it with a different energy than you would fight for something you had simply purchased or inherited without struggle. There was also the matter of what losing would have meant symbolically. The McIlhenny family had constructed an identity around this product that was inseparable from the island. The process, the name, and the specific history that connected Edmund's post-war experiment to the commercial enterprise that followed it. If Tabasco became a generic word, if any producer of hot sauce from any variety of capsicum pepper could call their product Tabasco without legal consequence, then the family's position in the market was fundamentally altered. They would no longer be the only makers of Tabasco sauce. They would be, at best, the original and most established maker of a type of sauce that anyone could make and name similarly, which is a considerably less comfortable commercial position. The competitor landscape they were fighting was not composed of small-time operators alone. New Iberia and the surrounding parishes were productive pepper-growing country, and the commercial opportunity was visible enough to attract producers who were genuinely well-organized and commercially serious. Greenheart Tabasco sauce was not a backyard operation. It was a commercial product with distribution and marketing support, and a legal team willing to argue the generic word position with some persistence. Other producers in the region observed the market and drew their own conclusions about the opportunity. The McElhenney family was, effectively, fighting to establish that the market for Tabasco-branded hot sauce was a market of one, which required convincing courts that the commercial identity of the word had been sufficiently established to justify that exclusive position. The proceedings produced some genuinely interesting moments in the history of trademark law, not because the McElhenney cases were the most important trademark disputes of the era, they were not, but because they engaged seriously with questions about geographic names, descriptive terms, and acquired distinctiveness that were being worked out across American commercial law during a period when the entire framework of intellectual property and commerce was still being constructed. The late 19th and early 20th century was a formative period for trademark law in the United States, a period when courts were still establishing the principles that would govern how commercial identifiers were treated legally. The McElhenney cases were part of that broader development, contributing to a body of precedent that went beyond any single sauce manufacturer's commercial interests. The family's legal strategy was not simply reactive, responding to each new infringer case by case and hoping for favorable outcomes. It was systematic. They documented their commercial use of the name with a thoroughness that reflected either excellent legal advice or the instincts of people who had been in financial businesses and understood that documentation was the foundation of any legal position worth having. They pursued not just the large commercial competitors, but the smaller ones as well, the regional producers and local grocers who might have thought that a small operation in a rural Louisiana town was beneath the attention of a hot sauce company on a nearby island. The message sent by pursuing small violators was as important as any individual case outcome. It established through a pattern of consistent enforcement that the family regarded the trademark as genuinely exclusive and would invest resources in defending it at any scale. One of the more striking elements of this campaign in retrospect is that it was conducted simultaneously with the actual business of making and selling hot sauce. The litigation was not the company's primary activity. It was a parallel operation, running alongside the production and distribution and marketing work that actually kept the lights on. Managing both required organizational capacity that a small family business in the 1890s was not obviously designed to support, and yet the family managed it, apparently by applying the same methodical attention to the legal campaign that Edmund had applied to the production process. Every new threat was assessed, every case was considered in the context of the overall strategy. The goal was not just to win individual disputes, but to build a legal record that made the overall trademark position progressively more difficult to challenge. The arguments on the other side continued to have force, and continued to find sympathetic audiences in some courts and in the trade press. The position that Tabasco was simply a descriptive geographic and botanical term, that it described peppers from a particular Mexican region, and that any sauce made from those peppers could legitimately be called Tabasco sauce, was not a frivolous position, and it was not one that courts uniformly rejected in the early years of the campaign. Some early rulings went against the family. Some early victories were reversed on appeal. The legal landscape was not a steady progression toward the final outcome, but a genuinely contested terrain that required sustained engagement over many years before the family's position became stable enough to be considered secure. The arguments the family made evolved over this period in response to what worked and what did not. The consumer recognition argument that buyers understood Tabasco on a label to mean the McElhenney product specifically was supported by commercial evidence that accumulated as the product's national distribution grew. By the early 20th century, the sauce had moved well beyond the Gulf Coast market where it had started. National distribution meant national consumer awareness, which meant the secondary meaning argument became progressively stronger with each year of continued commercial use. The longer the family maintained consistent use of the mark on a nationally distributed product, the harder it became for opponents to argue that consumers understood the word as merely descriptive rather than as a brand identifier. The national distribution itself was partly a strategic response to the trademark challenge. A product known only regionally is vulnerable to the generic word argument in a way that a nationally recognized product is not. If every American who encountered a bottle labeled Tabasco understood it to mean the McElhenny product, the argument that the word was merely descriptive became increasingly difficult to sustain. Expanding distribution was good commercial practice in its own right, but it also served the legal strategy by broadening the evidence base for consumer recognition. The family was building their trademark defense one bottle at a time, in the sense that every new customer who learned to associate the word exclusively with their product was a data point in the secondary meaning argument. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the particular absurdity of this entire situation from a certain angle. A family was spending decades in court fighting about whether a 6-letter word belonged to them, because that word appeared on a small glass bottle of hot sauce that cost $1 and was used in quantities of a few drops at a time. The financial stakes, in any individual transaction, were trivially small. The accumulated stakes, across the growing volume of a nationally distributed product over a period of decades, were enormous, and the legal principle at stake was genuinely significant beyond the commercial interests of any one company. It helped establish the framework through which American courts distinguished brand identifiers from generic descriptors, a distinction that matters for every trademarked product name in existence. All of this emerging from a dispute about who owned the word Tabasco, which is not, on its face, the most obviously important 6 letters in the English language. The former employee who had absconded with pepper seeds was, in comparison to the larger trademark battle, a relatively manageable problem. His operation, built on appropriated plant material without the McElhenny process or institutional knowledge, produced a product that was distinguishable enough from the original to limit its market impact, and the legal action against him established a clear precedent about what employees of the company could and could not take when they departed. The family subsequently became considerably more careful about the security of their plant material and the contractual arrangements governing the people who worked with it. Post-war Louisiana's informal labor arrangements, in which a handshake and an oral agreement were considered adequate documentation for most employment relationships, gave way, at least within the McElhenny operation, to more formal structures designed specifically to prevent recurrence. The pepper seeds themselves became a kind of proprietary resource that the family managed with increasing intentionality. The specific Tabasco pepper variety grown on Avery Island was, through the late 19th century, essentially maintained exclusively by the McElhenny operation for commercial production purposes. Other growers in Louisiana might grow similar peppers for personal or local use, but the large-scale commercial cultivation of the variety, developed through generations of selection and cultivation on a specific island with specific growing conditions, was an asset that the family understood needed protection beyond the legal trademark. The biological material and the legal protection worked together. Controlling the plant variety gave the family an advantage in producing the specific flavor profile the product was known for, while the trademark protected the name that identified that flavor profile in the market. The resolution of the 30-year legal campaign came not as a single dramatic verdict, but as the accumulated outcome of many smaller decisions and precedents that eventually solidified into a legal reality that competitors found essentially impractical to challenge. By the early decades of the 20th century, the McElhenny family's position on the word Tabasco was secure enough that new entrants to the hot sauce market generally chose not to use it, not because the legal question had been definitively resolved in every possible jurisdiction and on every possible theory, but because the family's demonstrated willingness to litigate aggressively, combined with the commercial evidence of consumer recognition, made the cost-benefit analysis of challenging them look unattractive. The best advertisement for the trademark's strength was the family's consistent behavior in defending it. Potential infringers could look at 30 years of cases and calculate reasonably that whatever marginal commercial advantage came from using the Tabasco name was not worth the litigation expense. This is, in many ways, the most important lesson of the entire period. The trademark did not protect itself. The patent from 1870, which had a fixed term, had expired. The recipe was not a secret in any meaningful sense. The basic process of fermenting ground peppers with salt and vinegar was not proprietary knowledge, and the general outlines of the fermentation approach were known to anyone who had spent time studying the operation. What protected the McElhenny product's market position was not a legal document that automatically excluded competitors, but a sustained pattern of behavior that made competition costly and unattractive. The family made it expensive to use their name. They made it complicated to access their plant variety. They made consistent quality a defining characteristic of their product in a period when consistency was genuinely difficult to achieve and maintain at scale. And they did all of this simultaneously for decades without losing interest or energy, or the willingness to pursue another case when another infringer appeared. John Avery McIlhenny and Edward Avery McIlhenny, the sons who inherited the business and conducted most of the early trademark campaign, were not, in other respects, people who spent most of their time in offices managing condiment companies. John left the company presidency to join Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders as a cavalry volunteer, participated in the charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War in 1898, and returned to Louisiana having added combat experience to his resume in a way that most hot sauce company presidents had not. Edward was a dedicated, self-taught naturalist with interests that extended well beyond the commercial operation of an island-based food manufacturer. These were not men whose whole identity was absorbed by the family business, which makes their sustained commitment to the trademark campaign all the more notable. They fought for the name because the name was what Edmund had built, and because losing it would have meant losing the thing that made the family's commercial position distinctive in a way that nothing else could replace. The Cornet Moss case, which had been the most commercially serious challenge and the one that most explicitly tested the generic word argument, was resolved in the McIlhenny family's favour, though the resolution was neither quick nor clean. The extended litigation produced a body of legal reasoning that established the secondary meaning of the Tabasco mark with sufficient clarity that subsequent challenges faced a much higher burden of proof. Greenheart Tabasco sauce eventually disappeared from the market, not because the McIlhenny family bought out the competition, or because the courts issued some sweeping permanent injunction, but because the legal and commercial arithmetic made continuing to fight unprofitable. The family had outlasted them, which in a trademark dispute is functionally equivalent to winning. The period also produced something unexpected from the outside: organizational growth. Managing a multi-decade legal campaign while simultaneously running a growing manufacturing operation required the family to build institutional capacity that a simple cottage industry operation did not possess. They needed lawyers, obviously, but they also needed record keepers, correspondence managers, distribution administrators, and the general bureaucratic infrastructure of a company that operated at national rather than regional scale. The litigation forced a kind of organizational maturation that might have happened anyway as the commercial operation grew, but which the legal pressure accelerated. By the time the trademark battles were largely resolved, the McIlhenny Company looked considerably less like a family farm operation and considerably more like a commercial manufacturer with the structures and processes that distinction implies. Edward Avery McIlhenny, who emerged as the dominant figure in the company's management from around the turn of the century through the first half of the 20th century, was in many ways the architect of the transition from family operation to organized company. His interests in natural history, in the ecosystems of the Avery Island environment, and in the broader question of what it meant to manage a piece of land responsibly over the long term, gave him a perspective on the business that was unusual for the era. He was not simply trying to maximize production and defend the trademark. He was thinking about the island as a system, about the relationship between the commercial operation and the natural environment that supported it, about what it would take to keep both functioning across generations. This perspective would produce some of the most interesting and, in at least one case, genuinely consequential decisions in the company's 20th century history, but those decisions belong to the chapters that follow this one. The significance of the 30-year legal campaign is that it answered a question Edmund had not quite articulated when he filed his patent in 1870. Was what he built a product or a brand? A product can be copied, a recipe can be reverse engineered, a process, once understood, can be replicated by anyone with the right equipment and ingredient access. But a brand, a word that means something specific in the minds of consumers, that carries accumulated trust and recognition and association, that represents not just a category but a source, that is something different. It cannot be taken by imitation. It can only be maintained by consistent quality and consistent defense, two activities that the McIlhenny family had demonstrated over 3 decades of unglamorous legal work they were prepared to sustain indefinitely. There is one more dimension of the trademark campaign that deserves attention before moving on: because it illustrates something about the nature of brand protection that is easy to miss when you focus only on the courtroom outcomes. The McIlhenny family did not just litigate, they communicated. Throughout the period of most intense legal activity, the family maintained and expanded the commercial visibility of the product with a consistency that served the legal strategy as much as the commercial one. They attended trade fairs and expositions, the great commercial theatre of the late 19th and early 20th century, where manufacturers presented their products to buyers, distributors, and the general public and competed for medals and certificates that were then reproduced on packaging as evidence of quality. The source collected awards. The awards went onto the labels travelled to new markets meant new consumers. New consumers meant broader evidence of consumer recognition. Consumer recognition was the cornerstone of the secondary meaning argument. The commercial activity and the legal strategy were, whether by design or by the natural alignment of good commercial practice with good legal practice, mutually reinforcing in ways that the competitors who focused purely on the legal challenge were not positioned to match. The trade expositions of the period were, it should be noted, not subtle affairs. The great world fairs and commercial exhibitions of the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s were exercises in industrial self-presentation conducted at a scale and with an earnestness that can be difficult to fully appreciate from the current era of digital marketing and social media. Companies built elaborate displays, they distributed samples, they printed promotional literature describing their products in language that would make a modern copywriter wince with its enthusiasm. Medals were awarded in categories so specific as to be almost satirical. Best condiment in a glass bottle, perhaps, or finest fermented pepper product from an island in Iberia Parish, Louisiana. Edmund's sons understood that presence at these events, and the certificates and medals that followed added documentary evidence of the product's commercial standing and consumer recognition. Whether a medal from a 19th century trade exposition was ever genuinely influential in a legal proceeding is a question best left to historians of trademark law. But the family collected them anyway, which cost relatively little and potentially helped relatively much. The word Tabasco, in the end, belonged to them. Not because Edmund had invented the pepper, and not because the name had never been applied to anything else, and not because the legal principle was simple or obvious or undisputed, but because even the hot sauce, which looks in retrospect like a bold commercial bet, was conceived as a practical solution to an immediate problem, rather than as a grand entrepreneurial vision. Edmund was not a man who charged hills. His sons were. The distance between Edmund's temperament and that of the next generation is not subtle. John Avery McIlhenny, the older of the two brothers who would shape the company's early 20th century trajectory, was the kind of person who, when presented with the option of either running a growing condiment company from the comfort of a Louisiana island or riding a horse into armed conflict in Cuba, chose the horse and the armed conflict without, apparently, experiencing very much internal debate about it. This is not the decision-making framework that most business school curricula cover in depth, but John did not attend business school, which was probably for the best given how things turned out. To understand John's decision, it helps to understand the particular cultural moment of 1898 and the extraordinary figure at its centre. Theodore Roosevelt was, by the spring of that year, already something considerably larger than his formal political resume suggested. He was serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which is a position most people could not describe the responsibilities of without consulting a reference. But Roosevelt was filling it with an energy and a sense of historical mission that made it clear the role was a staging ground rather than a destination. When the United States declared war on Spain in April of 1898, triggered by the explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor and by a press campaign that had been building toward exactly this kind of conflict for years, Roosevelt understood immediately what kind of moment it was and what kind of moment he wanted to be personally present for. He resigned from his Navy position and, with his friend Leonard Wood, began organizing a cavalry regiment that would be formally designated the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. The regiment acquired a nickname almost immediately, variously rendered as the Rough Riders, which captured something essential about its membership profile. Roosevelt and Wood recruited from two distinct populations that might have seemed, on paper, unlikely to function as a coherent military unit: college athletes and polo players from the Eastern establishment on one hand, and cowboys, frontiersmen, and experienced riders from the American West on the other. The result was, somehow, both a genuinely effective fighting force and an exceptionally good story which, given Roosevelt's instincts about the relationship between military adventure and political advancement, was probably not an accident. John Avery McIlhenny fit the profile of the regiment with somewhat embarrassing precision. He was from a prominent Southern family, he was educated, he was physically capable. He had the kind of social connections that made him a natural candidate for an officer's commission, rather than an enlisted man's bunk, and he was, by all available evidence, exactly the type of person who found the prospect of a cavalry charge considerably more compelling than another year of trademark litigation and production management decisions. Whether he discussed his decision to leave the family company with his brother Edward before acting on it is not documented in detail, but one imagines the conversation was relatively brief. John had made up his mind. The presidency of the Hot Sauce Company would wait. He joined the Rough Riders in the spring of 1898 and was part of the regiment's deployment to Cuba in June of that year. The campaign in Cuba was short by any historical measure of major military operations, roughly 3 months from deployment to armistice, but it was not particularly comfortable, which is an understatement of some scope. The men arrived in the Cuban heat in wool uniforms that had been designed for the American West and were completely unsuitable for subtropical Caribbean combat conditions. The food was inadequate. The logistics were, to use a military historian's term, chaotic. Tropical disease was killing more soldiers than enemy fire, which was itself saying something given the level of enemy fire encountered. The Spanish forces defending Cuba were not performing at the level of a demoralized opponent rolling over and accepting defeat. They were entrenched in strong positions with good fields of fire, and they needed to be removed by force. The assault on the fortified heights above Santiago de Cuba, including the complex of positions that encompass San Juan Hill, took place on July 1st, 1898. The Rough Riders, as dismounted cavalry, they had left their horses in Florida, which added a somewhat ironic dimension to the identity of a cavalry regiment, were part of the assault on Kettle Hill, an adjacent position to the main San Juan Hill objective. Roosevelt himself led the charge up Kettle Hill with a combination of personal courage and theatrical instinct that made for magnificent headlines and genuinely effective military leadership simultaneously, which is a rarer combination than it might appear. The men who followed him up that hill, including John Avery McIlhenny, did so under fire, across open terrain, against an entrenched defensive position. By the end of the day, the heights were in American hands. Within 2 weeks, the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbour had been destroyed. Within 2 months, the war was effectively over. John returned from Cuba with the particular status of a man who had been in a place that people were actively writing books about, under circumstances that the American press had decided represented something important about national character and military valour. The Spanish-American War was the kind of conflict that produces heroes at a rate that, in retrospect, sometimes outpaces the complexity of what actually happened. But the men who had served in it genuinely had served, and the ones who had been present at the major engagements carried that experience with a specific weight. John came back to Louisiana and eventually back to the family company, though his role shifted over subsequent years in ways that reflected both his experience and the fact that his brother Edward had, in his absence, proven himself considerably better suited to the day-to-day management of a manufacturing operation. Edward Avery McIlhenny is one of the more quietly extraordinary people in this entire story, which is saying something given the general level of unusualness running through the McIlhenny family's history. He was, by temperament and inclination, the opposite of a person who abandons an ongoing business to go to war. He was the kind of person who, given a piece of land with an interesting ecosystem, spends years systematically documenting everything living on it. He was the kind of person who, encountering a species he did not know, sat down and learned everything available about it before moving on. He was, in other words, a scientist in practice, if not in formal training, operating in the tradition of the great amateur naturalists of the 19th century, the tradition that produced people like Charles Darwin, who started his career as a gentleman with an interest in beetles and ended it having reorganized the foundational principles of biology. Edward had not gone to war with his brother. He had instead gone north. Specifically, he had joined an Arctic expedition, the kind of undertaking that, in the late 19th century, occupied a particular place in the imagination of the educated public as the ultimate test of human endurance and geographical ambition. The Arctic was the last great unknown on the map, the place where standard assumptions about what the physical world looked like stopped applying and where the combination of extreme cold, perpetual darkness for months at a time, and the complete absence of any of the support systems that made ordinary life possible combined to produce conditions that were, not to put too fine a point on it, extremely hostile to human survival. This was, naturally, exactly the kind of environment that drew a certain type of person with considerable reliability. The specific expedition Edward joined was aimed at the far north of the North American continent, in the territory around Point Barrow in Alaska, which is approximately as far north as you can go on the North American landmass before the land stops and the Arctic Ocean begins. Point Barrow sits above the 71st parallel, which means that during the depths of winter it experiences polar night, weeks of complete darkness without the sun rising at all above the horizon, and temperatures that make Louisiana winters seem, by comparison, like a pleasant autumn afternoon. Edward spent time there studying and documenting the wildlife of the region, working with the kind of systematic thoroughness that characterized his approach to natural history generally. The Arctic experience did several things for Edward that were relevant beyond the experience itself. It gave him an understanding of extreme environments and their specific biological characteristics that very few people in Louisiana or anywhere else in the American South possessed. It gave him a deep respect for the relationship between living things and the specific conditions of their habitat, an understanding that a species or an ecosystem removed from its native conditions does not simply adapt but fundamentally changes, sometimes in ways that cannot be reversed, and it gave him, perhaps most importantly, the particular confidence that comes from having survived conditions that most people would not voluntarily enter, which in practical terms meant that the challenges of modernizing a hot sauce manufacturing operation, managing a growing international distribution network, and simultaneously fighting trademark battles in multiple jurisdictions were not the kind of things that kept Edward awake at night. He took over the effective management of the McIlhenny Company around the turn of the 20th century and proceeded to hold that position for a period exceeding 50 years, which is a tenure so long that it begins to seem less like a career and more like a geological feature. During those decades, the company transformed from a regional family operation with Gulf Coast distribution and ongoing legal trouble into a manufacturer with genuine international reach, a modernized production facility, and a product that had moved well beyond its origins as a southern table condiment into something that people in Europe, in Asia, and eventually on every inhabited continent were buying and using. The international expansion was not an accident, and it was not quick. European markets, particularly in Britain and France, were the initial targets for export beyond North America, which was a sensible strategic choice, given that both countries had substantial culinary traditions that accommodated condiments and had trading relationships with the United States that made distribution logistics relatively manageable. The British market, specifically, took to the product with an enthusiasm that exceeded what the family had expected. British food culture of the early 20th century is not always described, by anyone who has studied it carefully, as being in the vanguard of global culinary adventure, but the British had strong opinions about condiments. Worcestershire sauce, HP sauce, various chutneys and pickle products had well-established places in the British pantry, and something with the specific heat profile and flavour complexity of the McIlhenny product found a ready audience among a population that understood the concept of a pungent, intensely flavoured condiment used in small quantities to enliven dishes that might otherwise be perfectly adequate but not exactly exciting. Whether the British were using it to compensate for something is a question best left unasked. The French market followed, driven partly by the presence of the product in New Orleans and the cultural connections between Louisiana's Creole culinary tradition and French cooking, and partly by the fact that French cuisine, despite its reputation for elaborate complexity, has always had a specific place for ingredients that add intensity, without requiring the cook to rebuild the entire dish around them. A bottle of concentrated pepper sauce fits naturally into a kitchen philosophy that emphasizes building flavor through controlled additions of specific elements, and the McIlhenny product, with its fermentation depth and its clean acidic finish, was genuinely useful in that context, rather than merely fashionable. Edward understood that selling into international markets required more than simply shipping bottles across the ocean and hoping for the best. Different markets required different distribution partners, different pricing structures, different approaches to how the product was presented and positioned. The British market wanted the product positioned as an exotic but reliable condiment from the American South, drawing on the romance of Louisiana cuisine in ways that made the provenance part of the appeal. The French market wanted something that could stand alongside their existing culinary tradition, without being positioned as a replacement for it, a complement, not a challenger. Edward navigated these distinctions with a commercial intelligence that was, like most of his capabilities, more sophisticated than his informal credentials might suggest. The modernization of the production operation was equally careful and equally thorough. The early stages of the manufacturing process, which in Edmund's time had been conducted largely with manual labour and simple equipment, were progressively mechanized as both the technology and the scale of production made mechanization practical. The fermentation process itself was not fundamentally altered. The basic sequence of grinding, salting, barreling and aging was preserved because it produced the specific flavour profile that the product's identity depended on, and Edward understood with the naturalist's instinct for the relationship between process and outcome, that changing the process would change the outcome in ways that customers would notice and would not welcome. But the handling of ingredients before and after fermentation, the bottling operation, the label application, and the general logistics of a manufacturing facility were all progressively updated to reflect the available technology of the early and middle 20th century. The pepper supply itself was a challenge that grew with the production volume. Avery Island could produce a certain quantity of peppers, but as international distribution expanded and domestic market penetration deepened, the island's agricultural capacity became a constraint. Edward developed relationships with pepper growers in other countries, Central and South American producers who could grow the specific Tabasco variety in suitable climates and in quantities that supplemented the island's own harvest. This arrangement maintained the island as the centre of the operation, the place where all the sauce was fermented and bottled, and from which the finished product travelled outward, while addressing the supply-side constraint that would otherwise have limited growth. The peppers came from multiple sources. The process happened in one place. The finished product carried one identity. This was not a compromise. It was a solution that preserved what mattered most while adapting the elements that needed to adapt. Managing the company for over 50 years meant managing it through a sequence of events that would have tested any organization's resilience. 2 world wars, a global economic depression, the industrialization of the American food system, the emergence of national supermarket chains that changed the distribution landscape for every food manufacturer in the country, the development of competitive hot sauce products from new entrants who observed the growing market and wanted a share of it. All of these arrived during Edward's tenure, and all of them required responses that balanced the company's commitment to its established process with the practical need to operate in a world that kept changing around it. The response to the competitive pressure from new hot sauce entrants is particularly interesting, because it illustrates the strategic logic that the family had been developing since the trademark battles of the previous generation. Edward did not try to compete on price, which was not available to a company committed to a labour-intensive fermentation process using island-sourced salt and an aging period that competitors were not willing to replicate because it was expensive and slow. He did not try to compete on volume in ways that would have required compromising the production quality that justified the premium price. Instead, he competed on consistency and authenticity and the accumulated weight of a product history that new entrants simply did not have. The bottle looked the same as it had when Edmund first designed it. The process was the same, the island was the same, the specific mineral contribution of Avery Island salt to the fermentation was the same. These things could not be purchased by a competitor. They could only be built over time, and time was the one thing a new entrant did not have. This is not to say Edward was inflexible. He was, in fact, quite willing to adapt the company's commercial practices, its distribution arrangements, its marketing approach, and its institutional structure to the changing requirements of the 20th century market. What he was not willing to adapt was the process. The 30-day minimum fermentation, which had by this point extended to considerably longer for the finished product, though the production stages involved multiple periods of aging, was non-negotiable. The specific pepper variety was non-negotiable. The island as the place of production was non-negotiable. Everything surrounding those 3 commitments was available for discussion and adjustment. Those 3 things themselves were not. This position was commercially rational, but it was also something more than commercial. Edward had spent years studying natural systems in which the specific relationship between an organism and its environment produced outcomes that could not be reproduced by transplanting the organism elsewhere or altering the environment. He understood, in a way that pure commercial logic might not have produced, that what made the product valuable was inseparable from where and how it was made. Change the place, change the process, change the ingredient, and you had something that might be superficially similar, but that lacked the specific character that made the original worth defending. He had seen enough ecosystems to know that you cannot replicate what a specific place produces simply by wanting to. You have to be there, doing the thing the right way, over the right amount of time. The naturalist's understanding of habitat and process applied, with remarkable directness, to the production of fermented hot sauce. The contrast between John and Edward as people could hardly have been more vivid, and yet the company benefited from both of them in ways that a single temperament could not have provided. John's willingness to charge hills, literally and figuratively, had given the company a certain quality of aggressive determination in the earlier trademark battles. His energy was of the kind that intimidates opponents and refuses to accept unfavourable outcomes as final. Edward's patience, his systematic attention to detail, his capacity to manage complex operations across long timescales without losing sight of the foundational principles that made them work. These were qualities of a different kind, less dramatic, and considerably more suited to building something that lasted. Their father had built the product. John had helped secure the name. Edward built the company around both of them, and built it to last in the way that only someone thinking across generations rather than across quarters can build. By the time Edward's tenure was drawing toward its close in the middle of the 20th century, the McIlhenny operation had been transformed in almost every logistical dimension from what Edmund had started in the late 1860s. The scale was incomparably larger. The geographic reach was genuinely global. The institutional structure was that of a real company rather than a family cottage industry. The workforce had grown from a family recruited from school to a professional operation with permanent employees and organised processes. The production technology, while preserving the essential fermentation sequence, had been modernised in all the ways that 6 or 7 decades of manufacturing progress had made possible and practical, and yet the bottle looked almost exactly the same as it had when Edmund first filled those recycled cologne containers and sealed them with green wax in 1868. The label had evolved, as labels do, but its basic elements, the name, the island, the family name, remained unchanged. The size was the same, the colour of the contents was the same, the price positioning was the same, not cheap, not trying to be cheap, positioned as something worth paying a premium for because it was genuinely different from the available alternatives. The things that had made the product distinctive in its first year of commercial sale were still the things that made it distinctive in 1950. This is either a sign of extraordinary consistency or a sign that Edmund had gotten it exactly right the first time, and that subsequent generations were wise enough to recognise it. Probably both. The Rough Riders and the Arctic seem, on the surface, like biographical footnotes, interesting personal history that belongs to the men rather than to the condiment company. But they are not footnotes. They are character evidence of a particular kind, evidence that the second generation of the McIlhenny family was composed of people whose ambitions and whose tolerance for difficulty went considerably beyond what the management of a small family food operation required. John did not need to go to Cuba. Edward did not need to go to the Arctic. They went because they were the kind of people who go, who are drawn to the edge of what is known and comfortable, who find the difficult thing more interesting than the easy thing, who measure themselves against conditions rather than against competitors. Applied to the commercial and institutional challenges of transforming the McIlhenny Company in the early 20th century, those qualities produced something that neither the Rough Riders nor the Arctic had directly trained them for, but that both, in different ways, had shaped them to be capable of. It is also worth saying something about the specific texture of the international expansion under Edward's management, because it illustrates a commercial instinct that is easy to describe in broad strokes, but that required considerable practical intelligence to execute in the actual conditions of the early 20th century. Shipping a fermented condiment across an ocean is not a simple logistical operation. The product needed to survive weeks or months of transit in conditions that varied enormously depending on the route, the season, and the general reliability of the shipping companies involved. Temperature fluctuations, humidity, rough seas, the various indignities that cargo containers inflict on their contents. All of these were real variables that could affect the quality of the finished product arriving at a British or French importer's warehouse. Edward's commitment to quality meant that bottles arriving in London or Paris had to be as good as bottles leaving the island, which required thinking carefully about packaging, about fill volumes, about the seal integrity of the bottles under changing atmospheric pressure, and about the specific conditions different markets experienced in different seasons. These are not romantic problems. They are the grinding practical details of running an international food distribution business, and Edward solved them with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else, by gathering information, by testing, by adjusting, and by building relationships with distributors who understood both the product's requirements and their local market's expectations. He was not a person who delegated understanding. He wanted to know how things actually worked at every stage of the process, from the pepper plants in the field to the bottle on the retailer's shelf in another country. This comprehensive attention is what allowed him to manage the operation for 5 decades without losing control of the quality that the product's reputation depended on. The British importers who first took on the product in quantity were, according to accounts from the period, initially uncertain how to position something that was considerably hotter and more intensely flavoured than the standard table condiments familiar to their customers. The traditional British approach to condiments ran toward the savoury and the vinegary, things like Worcestershire sauce and the various brown sauces that accompanied meat dishes, rather than toward the kind of immediate concentrated heat that Tabasco delivered. Edward, through correspondence and occasional personal visits, worked with British distributors on how to communicate the product to a market that needed education, rather than simply availability. The message was not simply that the product was extremely hot. It was that the product was precise and controllable, that a small amount delivered a specific flavour contribution that could be calibrated to taste, which was the kind of message that appealed to a cooking culture with strong opinions about not overpowering the primary ingredients of a dish. The Worcestershire sauce comparison was, in retrospect, a useful one for the British market, because Worcestershire had already established the template for an intensely flavoured small-quantity table condiment as a legitimate part of the British culinary toolkit. If Worcestershire was familiar and acceptable, then a different intensely flavoured condiment used in similar quantities occupied a recognisable commercial space. Edward did not invent this comparison, but he was not opposed to it either. Positioning the product alongside something familiar was more effective than positioning it as something entirely unprecedented that required consumers to completely rethink their condiment habits, which was not a realistic ask for a bottle sitting on a grocery shelf waiting to be noticed. The First World War, which disrupted international commerce in essentially every direction simultaneously, created complications for the export operation that required improvisation and patience in roughly equal measure. Shipping routes changed. Distribution partners in European markets faced their own institutional upheaval. The general disruption of normal commercial life across the Atlantic made maintaining consistent supply to international customers difficult in ways that were entirely outside the company's control. Edward managed this as he managed everything else, by focusing on what could be controlled, maintaining the quality and consistency of the product itself through all the external instability, and being patient about the international expansion, resuming once conditions allowed it. The domestic American market, which had been growing steadily throughout this period, provided enough commercial foundation that the international setbacks were survivable without requiring fundamental changes to the operation. The period between the 2 world wars, the 1920s and into the 1930s, was in some respects the most commercially interesting of Edward's long tenure. Prohibition, which took effect in 1920 and lasted until 1933, had the unexpected effect of significantly expanding the market for intensely flavoured food condiments. The theory, which has some empirical support from the period, is that the removal of alcohol from the table created an appetite for other sources of sensory intensity, for food that was more aggressively seasoned, more demanding of attention, more interesting as an experience in its own right. Hot sauce fits naturally into this narrative, though it is worth being cautious about attributing all market growth to a single cultural cause. What is clear is that during the Prohibition years the American market for the product grew, and grew in regions and in demographic groups that had not previously been significant customers. The depression that followed in the 1930s tested the premium pricing model in ways that the earlier recessions had not, because a prolonged period of severe unemployment and reduced consumer spending puts pressure on every purchase that is not strictly necessary, and a bottle of premium hot sauce is, strictly speaking, not necessary in the way that flour or salt are necessary. Edward's response was characteristic. He did not lower the price to maintain volume, because lowering the price would have repositioned the product in ways that would have been difficult to reverse and that would have undermined the quality and exclusivity positioning that was the foundation of the product's commercial identity. Instead, he focused on the argument that a small amount of the product went a very long way, that the price per use was actually quite modest given how little was needed to season a meal, which was a true argument and a useful one in an economic environment where people were counting pennies with considerable precision. Edmund had built something from nothing once. His sons, starting from something rather than nothing, built it into something larger still, without notably changing the thing itself. The sauce in the bottle at the end of Edward's long management was the same sauce Edmund had fermented in those first white oak barrels in the late 1860s. Everything around it had changed. The thing itself had not. Whether that is a tribute to Edmund's original insight or to Edward's determination to preserve it is, ultimately, a distinction without much practical importance. Both things are true, and the truth of one depends on the truth of the other. There is a particular category of historical irony that is so complete, so structurally perfect in the way it inverts a person's intentions against their outcomes, that it seems almost designed rather than accidental. Edward Avery McIlhenny's relationship with the natural world of Louisiana belongs firmly in this category. Not at the edges of it, not as a marginal case that requires some interpretive generosity to qualify, but squarely, definitively, almost uncomfortably at its centre. The man who did more to protect the wetlands and wildlife of the Louisiana coast than almost any private individual in the state's history is also, directly and personally, responsible for one of the most persistent and damaging ecological disasters currently affecting those same wetlands. Both of these things are true. They are true about the same person, arising from the same set of values and the same genuine commitment to the natural world, separated by roughly 20 years in the timeline of his life, and by about as much intellectual distance as it is possible to have between two actions by the same individual. Understanding the first part of that sentence requires understanding something about what Edward was actually doing with birds, because when the historical record says he banded more than 286,000 birds for scientific research, the number is large enough that it is easy to let it wash over you without registering what it actually represents. 286,000 individual birds, each one captured, handled, fitted with a small numbered metal band around one leg, recorded and released. The purpose of bird banding, attaching a uniquely numbered marker to a wild bird so that if the bird is later captured or found dead, its original location and banding date can be connected to its new location and date, is to generate data about migration patterns, survival rates, population dynamics, and the geographic movements of species across large distances and long timescales. It is patient, careful, systematic science that requires both excellent field skills and an almost monkish commitment to documentation. You do not band 286,000 birds by being casual about it. You band 286,000 birds by showing up in the field day after day for years. Edward's interest in birds was not separate from his broader naturalist orientation. It was one expression of a comprehensive engagement with the living world around him that extended from the birds in the air to the plants in the marsh, to the fish in the bayous to the insects on the vegetation. He was the kind of observer who noticed things, which sounds like a modest description until you spend time in a marsh and realize how much there is to notice and how much training and patience noticing it accurately requires. He kept records, he published findings, he corresponded with professional scientists at major universities and natural history institutions who valued his observations precisely because he made them with the rigor that distinguishes reliable field data from interesting but unverifiable anecdote. Edward did not have the institutional credentials of a university-trained biologist, but the quality of his work was such that the people who did have those credentials treated him as a peer rather than as an enthusiastic amateur. The bird situation that galvanized him from observation into direct action was one of the most visible and most consequent wildlife crises of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in North America, the systematic slaughter of wading birds for the millinery trade. The fashion industry of the period had developed what can only be described as an extraordinary appetite for bird feathers as hat decorations, and the feathers most prized were those of the large white wading birds, primarily egrets, in their breeding plumage. The specific feathers in question were the aigrettes, the long, delicate display feathers that adult egrets grew during breeding season, and that were, from the hat designer's perspective, extraordinarily beautiful. From the egret's perspective, breeding season was precisely the worst possible time to be killed, both because the birds were concentrated at nesting colonies in large numbers that made them easy to find, and because killing the adults during nesting meant the eggs and chicks they were raising died as well. The efficiency of the slaughter was, in the dismal arithmetic of wildlife exploitation, quite impressive. At the peak of the plume trade in the 1880s and 1890s, egret populations across the American South had been reduced to levels that represented a genuine threat to their long-term viability. Colonies that had numbered in the thousands of nesting pairs were being visited by commercial hunters, their adults shot in vast numbers, the remaining birds deserting the site for years afterward. The industry that purchased these feathers and incorporated them into fashionable women's hats was not unaware of where the feathers came from. It simply did not consider the source its problem, which was not an unusual commercial position for the era, and is, unfortunately, not entirely unprecedented in subsequent eras either. Edward observed what was happening to the egret colonies within and around Avery Island with the particular distress of someone who had been closely watching these birds for years, and who understood what the population data actually meant. The numbers were not going in a direction that ended well for the birds. The fashion industry had created a demand that the wild population could not sustain indefinitely, and the trajectory was clear enough to anyone willing to look at it objectively. Edward looked at it objectively and concluded that something needed to be done, which was not an unusual conclusion, but which he then actually translated into action, which was considerably less common. In 1895, Edward established what would eventually become known as Bird City on the Avery Island property, a managed sanctuary for herons, egrets, and related wading birds, designed to provide a protected nesting environment where the birds could breed without disturbance. The basic concept was not complicated. Create conditions that were attractive to nesting birds, protect those birds from human interference during the breeding season, and allow the population to recover under the shelter of that protection. The execution was more involved than the concept. Edward had to understand what specific habitat features made the birds choose a nesting site: the vegetation structure, the water depth, the proximity to feeding areas, the presence or absence of predators, and then provide or manage those features on the island property. He planted trees and shrubs of the types that the birds preferred for nesting. He managed water levels in the areas near the nesting sites. He actively excluded disturbance during the breeding months, and critically, he was patient. A wildlife recovery effort of this kind does not produce results on a commercial timescale. Birds do not arrive in numbers because someone has prepared a suitable habitat and is waiting expectantly. They arrive when they arrive, according to their own assessments of conditions, and the initial trickle of nesters at a new or recovering site can require years to build into the kind of thriving colony that makes the effort visibly worthwhile. Edward waited. The birds arrived, tentatively at first and then in increasing numbers, as word spread through whatever mechanism birds use to communicate that a particular location is safe and suitable and worth considering as a nesting destination. Within a decade of the sanctuary's establishment, the nesting populations at Bird City had grown from a handful of pairs to a colony of genuine significance. Within 2 decades, it had become one of the largest concentrations of nesting herons and egrets in the region, a functioning, self-sustaining wildlife community on a piece of private land in the Louisiana marshes, maintained entirely through the commitment and resources of one family. Theodore Roosevelt, who had a strong personal interest in wildlife conservation, and whose presidency from 1901 to 1909 was defined in part by an unprecedented expansion of federal protection for natural lands, encountered Edward and Bird City, and was, by accounts from the period, genuinely impressed. Roosevelt did not impress easily, and his conservation instincts were well developed enough that he could distinguish between a functioning wildlife sanctuary and a decorative gesture. When he described Bird City as the most remarkable wild bird reservation he had encountered in the country, which is approximately what the historical record says, though the exact phrasing varies by source, he was making a specific judgment about the quality and scale of what Edward had built, not simply offering polite encouragement to a Louisiana hot sauce manufacturer who had a fondness for herons. The federal designation that followed was significant not just for Avery Island, but as part of a broader pattern of conservation policy that was reshaping how Americans thought about wildlife and public lands during the Roosevelt years. The idea that the government had a legitimate interest in protecting wild places and wild creatures from commercial exploitation was not universally accepted in the early 20th century. It required active argument and political will to establish against the opposition of people who regarded wildlife primarily as a commercial resource and protected land primarily as wasted economic potential. Roosevelt provided the political will. People like Edward, who had demonstrated on their own private properties that wildlife protection was both practically achievable and genuinely valuable, provided the evidence that the argument was grounded in reality rather than sentiment. Edward's influence on Louisiana wetland protection extended beyond his own island. Over the years of his most active involvement in conservation work, his advocacy and his example contributed to the protection of approximately 175,000 acres of Louisiana coastal marshland, land that provided habitat for migratory and resident wildlife, that filtered water moving from the interior to the coast, that absorbed storm energy and reduced the damage done by hurricanes to the communities and properties behind it, and that represented an ecosystem of extraordinary biological richness that had been accumulating in its current form since the last major configuration of the Louisiana coast had settled into place over thousands of years. 175,000 acres. To put that in some kind of physical context, that is roughly 2.5 times the area of the city of Chicago, set aside and protected from the kind of commercial development and drainage that had been systematically eliminating coastal wetlands across Louisiana since the early 20th century. It was, by any reasonable measure, a conservation legacy of genuine and lasting significance. The birds that nested at Bird City, the waterfowl that used the protected marshes as stopover and wintering habitat along the Mississippi Flyway, the countless species of fish and invertebrate that depended on the vegetated marsh edges for breeding and nursery habitat, all of these benefited from decisions and advocacy that can be traced, in meaningful part, to Edward's personal commitment to the Louisiana coast and its wildlife. This is, in itself, a remarkable story. A man with no formal scientific training, managing a hot sauce company on a private island in southern Louisiana, becomes one of the most consequent wildlife conservationists in the state's history by the simple expedient of taking the natural world seriously, documenting what he observed with care, acting on what the evidence told him, and being willing to commit time and resources over decades to outcomes that had no commercial return. He did not protect birds because it was good for business. He protected birds because they needed protecting, and he was in a position to help, which is, without sentimentality, the most straightforward description of what conservation requires. And then, in 1938, he imported nutria. The South American nutria, Myocasta coipus, for those who enjoy a scientific name, is a large semi-aquatic rodent native to the southern parts of South America, primarily the temperate and subtropical wetland regions of Argentina, Chile, and neighbouring countries. It is, in its native habitat, a perfectly reasonable creature going about its business of eating aquatic vegetation, building burrows in banks, and contributing to its ecosystem in the ways that mid-level herbivores typically do. It is large. Adults typically reach 10 to 14 pounds, with some individuals growing considerably heavier, and it has a dense, soft underfur beneath a coarser outer coat that, in the 1930s, was commercially interesting to the fur industry as a substitute for more expensive pelts. Edward brought nutria to Avery Island as part of a plan to establish a fur farming operation. This was not an unusual commercial idea in the context of the 1930s. Fur farming had been a legitimate agricultural enterprise in various parts of North America for decades, raising animals specifically for their pelts in managed enclosures rather than relying on wild trapping. The Depression economics of the decade made new revenue streams attractive, and the fur trade was still a significant industry before synthetic alternatives had made serious commercial inroads. Nutria were appealing for fur farming because they reproduced quickly, adapted well to captive conditions, and produced a usable pelt without the management challenges associated with more temperamental fur-bearing animals. Edward established the nutria on the island in managed conditions. This is the crucial detail, the part of the story where the subsequent disaster was not yet inevitable. Nutria in enclosures are not an ecological problem, in a way that nutria released into uncontrolled wild habitat are an ecological problem. The animals he had acquired were initially managed animals. They were where he put them. At some point, the historical account is somewhat vague about whether this was a deliberate decision or an accident, and the McIlhenny family has, perhaps understandably, not been exhaustive in documenting the specifics of this particular episode. The nutria entered the Louisiana wetlands at large. whether some escaped, whether the fencing was inadequate, whether the flooding that periodically affects low-lying Louisiana land breached whatever containment existed, or whether Edward at some point decided that releasing them into the broader marsh was commercially reasonable is a question that the available record does not answer with satisfying precision. What is not in question is the outcome. Nutria in Louisiana's coastal marshes are not in their native habitat, but they found the conditions rather agreeable. The subtropical climate was warmer than their South American home range. The marshes offered abundant aquatic vegetation of exactly the types they prefer to eat. The native predator community of Louisiana, alligators, large wading birds, and the other residents of the coastal ecosystem, was not configured to significantly suppress a population of large, fast-reproducing rodents that had not previously been part of the local food web. Natural predation works most effectively on species that have evolved alongside their predators, where the prey population and the predator population have developed a relationship over generations that keeps both within bounds that the ecosystem can sustain. Introducing a species that the local predators have no experience with creates a population dynamic that can take a very long time to reach any kind of equilibrium, if it reaches one at all. Nutria reproduce at a rate that the polite description calls prolific. Females can begin breeding at 3 to 4 months of age. They can produce 2 to 3 litters per year. Each litter contains anywhere from 2 to 13 offspring, with 5 or 6 being typical. The math compounds quickly. A small founder population of Nutria, experiencing essentially unconstrained growth in the absence of effective natural predation, can multiply to extraordinary numbers in a relatively short period. The Louisiana Nutria population did exactly this, with the thoroughness and speed that basic population ecology would predict. By the estimates current to the early 21st century, the Louisiana Nutria population has reached approximately 20 million individuals. 20 million animals, each eating aquatic marsh vegetation as their primary food source, each doing so in ways that cause specific and cumulative damage to the marsh plant communities they inhabit. The feeding behaviour of Nutria is not like that of most grazing animals, which eat the above-ground portions of plants and allow the root systems to persist and regenerate. Nutria eat the roots and rhizomes, the underground parts of marsh plants that anchor the vegetation to the substrate and allow it to regrow after grazing. When Nutria eat the roots of marsh grass, the grass does not regrow. The substrate that the grass was holding in place is no longer stabilized. In the specific conditions of Louisiana coastal marshland, where the soil is soft, wet, and highly susceptible to erosion, the removal of root systems by Nutria feeding creates bare patches of open water where solid marsh existed before. These patches do not naturally revegetate at a rate that matches the pace of Nutria feeding. They expand. They connect with adjacent patches. What was marsh becomes open water, and open water in a coastal environment subject to tidal influence, storm waves, and subsidence tends to stay open water. Louisiana was already losing coastal land at a rate that ecologists and geologists considered alarming, well before the Nutria population reached its current scale. The combination of natural subsidence, the interruption of sediment supply by river channelization, sea level rise, and various other factors had been eroding the state's coastal land area throughout the 20th century. The Nutria problem accelerated and compounded a process that was already occurring, transforming sections of marsh that might have persisted for additional decades or centuries into open water on a much faster timeline. The Louisiana coastal wetlands do not simply represent wildlife habitat, though they represent that in enormous quantities. They represent the buffer zone between the Gulf of Mexico and the developed inhabited portions of southern Louisiana, the natural protection system that absorbs storm surge energy during hurricanes and reduces the damage those storms do to the communities behind the marsh. The implications of this are direct and personal for Avery Island. The island sits in the coastal marshes. Its protection from storm surge depends, in meaningful part, on the integrity of the marsh surrounding it. As the marsh degrades, as open water replaces vegetated wetland in the areas between the island and the Gulf, the island's vulnerability to major storm events increases. The nutria that Edward introduced in 1938, the nutria that escaped or were released into the broader Louisiana coastal system, the 20 million descendants of those animals that are presently eating the roots of marsh grasses across southern Louisiana, they are, in a very direct causal chain, reducing the natural protection of the same island and the same coastal ecosystem that Edward devoted much of his life to protecting. The The state of Louisiana, recognizing this, has maintained nutria control programs for years. The current approach includes a bounty system, approximately $6 per nutria tail, submitted to wildlife officials, generating roughly $2.5 million in annual payments for an annual harvest of around 400,000 animals. 400,000 animals removed per year, against a population of 20 million. By a back-of-the-envelope calculation that does not account for reproduction rates, you can see immediately that removal alone is not going to solve the problem. The bounty system is, at best, a modest brake on continued population growth rather than a path toward elimination. It is the wildlife management equivalent of bailing a boat with a teacup, an activity that is better than not bailing and that does not get you back to shore. The paradox of Edward Avery McIlhenny, the man who saved the egrets and introduced the nutria, who protected 175,000 acres of wetland and set in motion the mechanism that continues to destroy wetland today, is not really a paradox if you think about it carefully enough. It is instead a precise illustration of something that conservation biologists and ecologists have had to relearn repeatedly across the history of wildlife management, that good intentions combined with incomplete understanding produce outcomes that may be as damaging as indifference combined with bad intentions. Edward understood the egret problem deeply, in all its biological and ecological dimensions, because he had been watching egrets for years and knew exactly what was happening to them and why. He understood the nutria problem not at all, because the nutria was an unfamiliar animal in an unfamiliar ecological context, and his assessment of the risk was wrong in ways that the subsequent 60 years made painful and increasingly expensive to document. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is an honest one. Edward was not negligent. He was not reckless in the way that implies an absence of care. He was wrong in a way that can happen to careful, knowledgeable, well-intentioned people when they encounter a system they do not fully understand and make decisions based on the understanding they have. The gap between his conservation achievements and his ecological mistake is not the gap between good and bad character. It is the gap between what he knew and what there was to know, which, in ecological science even today, remains uncomfortably large. Bird City still exists on Avery Island. It is still active. The nesting colonies of herons and egrets that Edward established in 1895 are still there, still producing young birds each spring, still functioning as a refuge in a coastal landscape that has become considerably more pressured than it was when he planted the first nesting trees. Visitors to the island can see them, the great egrets and snowy egrets and little blue herons nesting in the trees above the water, raising their chicks, feeding in the marsh edges around the island, carrying on the business of being birds with a magnificent indifference to the human history surrounding them. The bird city that Edward built still works. That is not nothing. The nutria are also still there, in the marsh surrounding the island and throughout the Louisiana coastal system, still eating roots, still converting vegetated wetland into open water at a rate that no currently available management approach has been able to arrest. They are the most persistent consequence of a decision made 80-some years ago by a man who spent his life caring about the natural world and who made one catastrophic misjudgment about an animal he did not know well enough. Both of these things, the living bird city and the continuing nutria problem, exist simultaneously in the same landscape as the joint legacy of a single person's engagement with the natural world of southern Louisiana. The lesson, if there is one beyond the obvious caution about introducing non-native species to unfamiliar ecosystems, a lesson that the 19th and 20th centuries taught in approximately this same way in Australia, in Hawaii, in New Zealand, in the Florida Everglades, and in enough other places that you would think the principle might have become intuitive by now, is that understanding a system and acting within that system are two different things, and the gap between them is where most ecological disasters live. Edward understood birds because he had studied birds for his entire adult life. He did not understand nutria, and in acting within the Louisiana coastal system on the basis of incomplete understanding, he created a consequence that his considerable expertise in the natural world could not prevent, and that his considerable conservation legacy could not balance out in any practical sense. It is also worth saying something about the specific social and cultural position that Edward's conservation work occupied in Louisiana during the first half of the 20th century, because it was not a position without friction. Conservation and economic development are not natural allies in any era, and in early 20th century Louisiana, where the extraction of natural resources, timber, oil, gas, Fish, wildlife, was a foundational part of the regional economy and identity. The idea that some resources should be left unexploited was not universally welcome. The people who trapped and hunted and fished the coastal marshes for a living were not, as a group, enthusiastic about restrictions on their access to those marshes, and the political interests aligned with resource extraction were powerful enough to resist regulatory frameworks that might have slowed the rate at which the Louisiana coast was being developed, drained, and commercially exploited. Edward operated in this environment with the particular authority that came from being a credible expert rather than an outside moralist. He was not a northerner arriving to lecture Louisianans about the importance of their wetlands. He was a Louisiana man, born and raised on an island in the coastal marsh, who had spent decades studying the ecosystem with a depth and consistency that nobody could dispute. When he made arguments about the value of the marsh, he made them with the specificity and detail of someone who had personally observed what happened when specific marshes were drained or hunted out or otherwise degraded. This gave him a standing in local conservation debates that a purely academic or institutional advocate would not have had, and he used that standing effectively in the campaigns that eventually secured protection for substantial areas of coastal wetland. The 175,000 acres that came under protection through his influence were not acquired through a single legislative act or a single negotiated agreement. They were accumulated over years through a combination of land purchases, conservation easements, federal and state designations, and private agreements with landowners who were persuaded, sometimes by logic, sometimes by example, sometimes by the practical demonstration that protected marshland retained long-term value in ways that degraded marshland did not, to commit their properties to non-development uses. It was slow, patient, incremental work of the kind that does not generate headlines, but that produces durable outcomes in a way that dramatic gestures rarely do. The ornithological work, the bird banding, the population studies, the documentation of nesting and migration patterns, fed into this broader advocacy in ways that are easy to underestimate if you think of scientific data and political argument as separate activities. The data Edward generated was evidence. It demonstrated in quantifiable terms what was happening to bird populations under different land management regimes. It showed, concretely, that protected areas produced different outcomes than unprotected ones. This kind of evidence was not always decisive in debates where economic interests were substantial, but it was cumulatively useful, and the body of work Edward built over decades became a resource that subsequent conservation advocates could draw on long after he was gone. The banding records alone, 286,000 individual birds, each documented with location, date, species, age, sex, and subsequent recovery information where available, constituted a dataset of genuine scientific value. Migration routes across the Gulf of Mexico, which were incompletely understood in the early 20th century, were documented in part through recoveries of birds originally banded on Avery Island and subsequently captured or found in Central and South America, in the Caribbean, or in other parts of North America. The picture of where these birds went when they left the Louisiana coast, how far they travelled, what routes they followed, was assembled piece by piece from banding records like Edward's, and the scientific understanding of hemispheric bird migration that exists today owes a partial debt to the people who did this patient, unglamorous fieldwork across the first half of the 20th century. The irony that Edward's most consequential single action in terms of lasting ecological impact was not any of this carefully documented, deliberately beneficial work, but rather the introduction of a South American rodent that he probably thought about for a fraction of the time he spent on birds. This irony is, ultimately, the most instructive thing about him. It is a reminder that the relationship between effort and outcome in complex natural systems is not proportional. 20 million nutria is not a reflection of 20 million units of careless decision-making. It is the compounding result of a single decision made without sufficient understanding of the system into which it was introduced. The birds Edward protected required decades of sustained effort. The damage the nutria cause requires no effort at all and stops for no one. Bird City and the nutria are both his, the egrets nesting in their trees above the Avery Island marsh and the animals chewing the roots of that same marsh into open water are both products of the same man's engagement with the same landscape. That is not a paradox. That is a portrait, drawn in the colours that the natural world uses when it records what people actually do rather than what they intend. Walter Stauffer McIlhenny went to war in 1942 as a Marine officer and came back from it as something rather harder to categorize. He was Edmund's grandson, which meant the hot sauce was in the family background the way a particular house or a difficult relative is in the family background. Present, defining in ways you do not always appreciate until you are older, occasionally mentioned in contexts that strike you as improbable. He had grown up on Avery Island with the whole accumulated weight of what the family had built there, and he left it to serve in one of the most brutal campaigns the Pacific War produced. That he came back at all is, by the specific arithmetic of Guadalcanal, not something that should be taken for granted. Guadalcanal in 1942 and 1943 is not a name that carries much immediate meaning for most people who did not grow up in military families or study the Pacific Theatre in detail, which is an oversight that the history of that campaign does not particularly warrant. The island in the Solomon Islands chain became, from August of 1942 onward, the site of an extended, grinding, extraordinarily costly battle between American and Japanese forces for control of an airfield that both sides understood, correctly, to be strategically decisive for the entire course of the Pacific War. The fighting on Guadalcanal was not the kind of clean, advancing against retreating enemy combat that military briefings describe in clean lines. It was dense jungle terrain, extreme tropical heat and disease, supply lines that were at best unreliable, and an opponent who was prepared to continue fighting under conditions that would have broken less determined forces. It was, to use a clinical understatement that would be familiar to anyone who was there, extremely unpleasant. Walter was present for a significant portion of it. He was there through the kind of close combat that the island's terrain made unavoidable. The jungle was thick enough that engagements often happened at distances where you could see the individual faces of the people you were fighting, which is a dimension of combat experience that does not translate well to maps or official unit histories, but that shapes the people who survive it in ways that last the rest of their lives. The encounter that produced Walter's most documented wound involved a Japanese officer's katana, the traditional sword that Japanese officers carried in addition to their firearms. The blow connected with Walter's skull. The fact that this sentence exists, that there is a subsequent history to describe, means the wound was survivable. But surviving a sword blow to the head is not the same as escaping unscathed. It left its mark in the most literal physical sense, and Walter carried the evidence of that particular morning on Guadalcanal for the rest of his life. He continued fighting and was eventually evacuated, and the trajectory of his subsequent military career, he achieved the rank of Brigadier General, which is a rank that requires both performance and survival across a considerable span of military service, speaks to the kind of person who emerges from that kind of experience still functioning, still capable of the judgment and leadership that advancement requires. The Marine Corps does not promote people to general officer rank because they were once in a difficult place and got out of it. It promotes people who demonstrated, across years of subsequent service, that they could take the things the difficult place gave them and use them rather than being defined by them. Walter returned to civilian life and to Avery Island after his military service, taking over the management of the McElhenney Company in 1949 and holding that position until 1985. The 36 years of his tenure represent the longest single management period since Edwards, and they coincide with the decades in which the product completed its transformation from a regionally prominent condiment to a genuinely national and globally recognized one. Much of the commercial and logistical groundwork for that transformation had been laid by Edward before Walter arrived. The international distribution relationships, the modernized production facility, the brand identity that had been built over decades of consistent commercial behavior, what Walter and capable of providing adequate nutrition under conditions where elaborate preparation is not available. It also has to be, in some reasonable sense, edible. This last requirement is where military ration design has historically struggled. The caloric and nutritional requirements of a soldier under physical stress are genuinely enormous, easily 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day, with elevated protein and carbohydrate needs. And meeting those requirements in a shelf-stable, packable format produces food that tends to be uniform in texture, lacking in fresh flavour, and characterized by the specific kind of culinary monotony that results from having the same limited set of preserved items available in every combination imaginable. Military rations have been the subject of soldier complaint for as long as there have been military rations, which suggests the problem has been consistent across centuries of military history, though the performance. The inclusion of a small bottle of Tabasco sauce in MRE packages addressed this problem with elegant simplicity. It did not change the fundamental nature of the food. It did not solve the shelf stability challenge or introduce fresh ingredients. What it did was give soldiers a tool for making whatever was in the package taste like a deliberate choice, rather than a default. A small amount of intensely flavored condiment applied to otherwise adequate but uninspiring food transforms the experience of eating it in a way that is entirely disproportionate to the amount of space the condiment occupies in the package. The flavor intensity, the specific combination of heat and acid that the fermentation process produces, cuts through the flatness of preserved food in a way that a milder condiment would not. It gives the meal a sensory event, a moment of engagement that the food itself was not providing. The miniature bottle designed for MRE inclusion was, practically speaking, one of the more quietly clever pieces of product design in the McIlhenny Company's history. It was small enough to fit in a soldier's pocket alongside the other condiment packets in the ration. It was glass, which in a military context is normally a problematic packaging material, but which was used here because the amount of liquid was small enough and the bottle robust enough that breakage was a manageable rather than systematic problem. The distinctive shape of the full-size bottle was preserved at miniature scale, which meant that the tiny MRE bottle was immediately recognizable as the same product a soldier might have grown up with at the family dinner table, creating a continuity of brand identity across contexts that most marketing professionals would find difficult to engineer deliberately. The cultural significance of the MRE bottle went considerably beyond its practical function. Soldiers adapted to the product, developed preferences for how to use it with specific ration entrees, traded bottles with each other to accumulate preferred condiment supplies, and generally incorporated the tiny glass bottle into the specific material culture of military service in the way that certain items of equipment and certain small comforts acquire totemic significance in the context of sustained hardship. The MRE Tabasco bottle became, over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, a recognizable artifact of American military culture, small enough to be everywhere, distinctive enough to be immediately identifiable, associated with the specific experience of being a soldier in the field in a way that no amount of conventional advertising could have manufactured. The commercial consequence of this cultural embedding was what Walter had understood from the beginning. Every American who serves in the military is young when they serve. They are, in demographic terms, exactly the consumer cohort that brand marketing most prizes. People at the beginning of their adult consumer lives, forming the product preferences and brand loyalties that will shape their purchasing behavior for the next several decades. A soldier who spends 2 or 4 or 20 years in the military eating MREs that include Tabasco sauce is not simply a consumer who has been exposed to the product. They are a consumer who has associated the product with a highly significant period of their life, with the specific intensity of military experience, with the small sensory consolations that matter enormously when the general circumstances are difficult. That kind of association does not produce casual brand loyalty. It produces the kind of loyalty that manifests as a specific bottle on a kitchen shelf for the next 40 years, and as the specific hot sauce recommended to a child or a friend without much reflection about why this particular one. Walter did not design this mechanism consciously, in the sense that he did not sit down with a consumer psychology textbook and identify the military as a brand-embedding distribution channel. He understood it with the practical intelligence of someone who had been in the military, who had experienced from the inside what it meant to have access to something familiar and good under difficult conditions, and who understood that the product his family had made for 80 years was exactly the kind of thing that carried disproportionate meaning in exactly that context. He pursued the military contract with the combination of personal credibility. A brigadier general approaching military procurement officials has a certain advantage in the conversation that a civilian marketing executive does not, and commercial instinct, and he secured an arrangement that functioned as one of the most effective brand-building programs the company had ever had, while simultaneously providing a genuine service to the people eating those rations. The product that left Avery Island for military distribution was the same product that left Avery Island for grocery stores. This is worth noting because it would have been commercially tempting to produce a cheaper or simplified version for the military contract, a version without the full aging period perhaps, or with a reduced fermentation quality, and to reserve the full quality product for the premium retail market. The McIlhenny Company did not do this. The miniature bottle contained the same sauce as the full-size bottle. This consistency was both a reflection of the family's commitment to process quality Across all uses of the product and practically a smart commercial decision, soldiers who became loyal consumers of the genuine article were more valuable as brand ambassadors than soldiers who had consumed a military-specific formulation and might or might not make the connection to the product in civilian stores. The 3.5 decades of Walter's management were also the period in which the specific geopolitical position of the United States created a global distribution system for the product that no private company could have funded or structured independently. American military bases, American foreign service posts, American commercial operations overseas, all of these created institutional demand for products from home in locations all over the world, and Tabasco was well positioned enough in American culinary culture by the 1950s and 1960s that it travelled with American influence in the way that certain other American products travelled. It appeared on military bases in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East. It appeared in American-operated hotels and restaurants in dozens of countries. Each appearance seeded a local consumer awareness that the company's direct marketing and distribution could then build on. The Cold War, with its accompanying expansion of American military and commercial presence across the globe, was not exactly a planned component of the McIlhenny international strategy, but it functioned as one. Walter died in 1985, having managed the company through 3.5 decades of substantial growth and through the establishment of the military association that would prove to be one of the most durable elements of the product's cultural identity. He had arrived at the job with a katana scar and a brigadier general's rank, and a family legacy that went back to a post-war pepper planting in 1868. He left it with the product on Air Force One, in space shuttle rations, and in the pocket of every American soldier deployed anywhere in the world that the United States military operated, which by 1985 was most of the places on the map. The island he left behind was, physically and geographically, in a more precarious position than it had been when he took over, not because of anything the company had done or failed to do, but because the Louisiana coast that surrounded it had been losing ground to the Gulf of Mexico at a rate that the state's geologists tracked with a mixture of scientific precision and genuine alarm. The numbers, which have been measured and remeasured and confirmed through multiple independent methodologies, represent one of the most significant ongoing land loss events in North America. Since 1932, which is roughly when consistent measurement of Louisiana coastal change began, the state has lost over 5,000 square kilometers of coastal land to open water. That is an area roughly the size of the state of Delaware, gone from solid or semi-solid marsh to open Gulf water in less than a century. To describe this as significant coastal change is to engage in the kind of understatement that eventually stops being a rhetorical device and starts being a failure of communication. The causes are multiple and interlocking in ways that make attributing the loss to any single factor an oversimplification, though the temptation to do so is understandable given the scale of what is happening. The Mississippi River Delta system, which built the Louisiana coast over thousands of years by depositing sediment carried from the interior of the continent, has been largely disconnected from its natural process of land building by the system of levees and channels constructed throughout the 20th century to control flooding and maintain navigation. The levees that protect New Orleans and the communities along the river from catastrophic flooding also prevent the river from depositing new sediment on the delta, which means the land that was built over millennia is no longer being replenished at a rate that offsets its natural subsidence. The ground is sinking, as it always has, but the river sediment that used to replace what sank is now going directly to the deep Gulf rather than spreading across the delta. Subsidence, the interruption of sediment deposition, the extraction of oil and gas from formations beneath the coastal zone, sea level rise, all of these factors compound each other in a landscape that has essentially no topographic margin. The Louisiana coast does not have hills. It does not have rocky shorelines or resistant geology that could slow the rate of erosion. It is soft, wet, low-lying, accumulated over geological time from river sediment that is barely above sea level in the best of circumstances. Remove the processes that maintain it, add the processes that degrade it, and the result is a coast that retreats faster than any other in the United States. The nutria, as discussed previously, add a specific and measurable component to this loss by removing the root systems of marsh grasses that would otherwise hold the soft substrate in place. $6 per tail, 400,000 animals per year, 20 million animals total. The arithmetic of that situation remains exactly as discouraging as it was when introduced. Avery Island sits in this landscape as an elevated exception, protected by its geological origin as a salt dome from the immediate flooding risk that affects lower-lying areas, but not exempt from the broader trend. As the marsh surrounding the island retreats, as open water replaces vegetated wetland in the areas between the island and the Gulf, the storm surge protection that the marsh provides diminishes. A healthy coastal marsh absorbs storm energy, wave action, wind-driven surge, the enormous hydraulic forces that a major hurricane moves across the landscape, in ways that reduce the intensity of what reaches the land behind it. Degraded marsh does this less effectively. Open water does not do it at all. In September of 2005, Hurricane Rita made landfall on the Texas-Louisiana border with the kind of intensity that requires recalibrating your sense of what weather can actually do. Rita was, at its peak, a Category 5 hurricane, the maximum on the Saffir-Simpson scale, with maximum sustained winds exceeding 290 kilometers per hour. By the time it reached the coast, it had weakened somewhat, as storms do when they encounter the cooler, shallow waters of the continental shelf, but it was still a Category 3 at landfall, which is a category that produces the kind of storm surge that moves inland in ways that bear only a passing relationship to the normal behavior of water. The surge from Rita moved through the Louisiana coastal marshes and into the lower elevations of Iberia Parish. At the McIlhenny manufacturing facility on Avery Island, the storm surge came within a measurement that people describe differently, depending on their relationship to precision and to drama. By some accounts it was centimeters, by other accounts it was a matter of a few inches. The consistent element in all the accounts is the word close. The water came close. Close enough that the people responsible for the facility's continued operation understood with a clarity that the near miss produced, that the margin between a functioning condiment manufacturer and a flooded one was thinner than any comfort-seeking interpretation of the island's geological elevation had suggested. The response was characteristic of how the McIlhenny family has historically dealt with threats to the island, not by relocating or by accepting the risk as manageable, but by building something. A $5 million earthen levee, 16 feet high, encircling the 40 acres of the production facility. 16 feet is not a modest engineering response to a near miss. It is the kind of structure that takes a serious engineering assessment of the worst realistic storm scenario and adds a margin of safety on top of that, because the people commissioning it have thought carefully about what happens if the worst scenario exceeds the estimate and have decided they are not interested in finding out experimentally. The levee was built to protect against the kind of storm surge that a major hurricane tracking directly over the Louisiana coast could produce in the current coastal conditions, which, given the ongoing land loss discussed above, are more threatening than the equivalent storm would have been several decades ago. The cost of $5 million for a levee protecting a hot sauce factory might seem disproportionate until you consider what the factory protects. Every bottle of Tabasco sauce produced in the world is produced on this island. The aging barrels, the fermentation facility, the bottling operation, the production infrastructure that has been built and refined over a century and a half, all of it is in this one location. There is no backup facility. There is no alternative production site that could absorb operations if Avery Island became inaccessible or inoperative. The island is the company in a way that is true of very few manufacturers at any scale, let alone one producing 700,000 bottles per day. Harold Osborne, who currently serves as the company's chief executive and who is Edmund McIlhenny's great-great-grandson, holds a graduate degree in environmental studies from Oxford. This biographical detail functions differently in the context of everything that has come before in this account. At the beginning of the story, at the point where a young man from Maryland arrived in New Orleans with no inheritance and no connections and built a banking career from nothing, a great-great-grandson with an Oxford ecology degree would have seemed an almost absurdly remote eventuality. At this point in the story, given what the island is facing and what it has already survived and what the current trajectory of the Louisiana coast implies about the next 50 years, an ecological education seems less like a personal interest and more like an operational necessity. Harold understands the coastal system his family's island sits in with a technical depth that none of his predecessors had. He understands the subsidence dynamics, the sediment flux, the relationship between marsh health and storm surge attenuation, the specific mechanisms by which sea level rise interacts with the various other factors affecting the coast. He understands, in quantitative terms, what the models suggest about the trajectory of the Louisiana coast under various climate scenarios. He understands the nutria problem in its full biological and ecological dimensions, including the part where his great-great-uncle introduced the animals that are currently contributing to the degradation of the habitat that protects his island. This is not comfortable knowledge, but it is the kind of knowledge that allows for realistic planning rather than optimistic assumptions. The current leadership of the company engages with coastal restoration science, with wetland remediation projects, with the policy frameworks governing how Louisiana manages its coastal land. These are not simply philanthropic activities, though they have philanthropic dimensions. They are also practical responses to the existential reality of operating a major manufacturing facility in a coastal environment that is measurably deteriorating. Protecting the wetland around the island is not just a conservation value, though it is that. It is also, in the most direct functional sense, protecting the buffer between the factory and the Gulf of Mexico. The company has also been involved in wetland restoration projects in Louisiana that go beyond simply protecting the island's own perimeter. Coastal restoration at the scale required to meaningfully address Louisiana's land loss problem requires government funding, engineering capacity, and political will that no private company can provide independently. But there is meaningful work that private landowners and companies can do within their own properties and in partnership with restoration efforts. The McIlhenny Company's engagement with these projects reflects the practical understanding that the island's long-term commercial viability depends on the health of the coastal system surrounding it, a dependency that earlier generations of the family understood intuitively, but that Harold Osborne can now quantify with the specific metrics of coastal ecology. The cultural weight of the island itself, separate from any specific ecological calculation, is also part of what motivates this engagement. The island is not simply the location of a factory, it is the location of everything the family has been for 150 years. The fermentation barrels are there. Bird City is there, still functioning, the egrets still nesting in the trees Edward planted. The salt dome is still there, far below, its geological permanence a quiet counterpoint to the surface fragility of the coastal landscape above it. The graves of Edmund and Mary Eliza McIlhenny are there. The place carries accumulated meaning of the kind that cannot be relocated or replicated, and the people who bear that meaning feel an obligation to the place that is not fully expressible in commercial terms. The 5-metre levee and the Oxford Ecology degree represent two ends of the same strategic response to the same set of physical realities. One is an immediate protective measure against the threat that is already present and measurable. The other is the kind of systemic understanding that allows for engagement with the longer-term problem. The coastal land loss, the marsh degradation, the increasing vulnerability of a low-lying island as the buffering wetland around it continues to thin. Neither one solves the underlying problem. The underlying problem is large enough and rooted deeply enough in the physical geography of the Louisiana coast that it does not have a clean solution available at the scale of a single private landowner, however motivated. What they represent, taken together, is something that runs consistently through the McIlhenny family's relationship with the island across 5 generations, the refusal to treat the threats facing the place as someone else's problem to solve. Edmund came back to a burned and ruined island and planted peppers. Edward built a wildlife sanctuary and protected 175,000 acres of wetland. Walter built a levee. Harold studies coastal ecology at Oxford. The specific response changes with the specific threat and the specific available tools. The underlying posture does not change. The island is what they have, and they are going to deal with whatever is happening to it with whatever they have available to deal with it. The water that nearly reached the factory in September of 2005 was Gulf water that had been pushed by a major storm across the diminished Louisiana marsh. The marsh was thinner than it had been in 1938 before the nutria arrived, and thinner still than it had been in 1895 when Edward was planting the first trees for Bird City. The island that Edmund retreated to in 1865 with nothing but a ruined property and a determination to start again was, by 2005, both more commercially valuable and more physically vulnerable than it had been in any previous period of its history. Those two facts are connected. The commercial success attracted attention, required infrastructure, created a facility that needed protecting. The physical vulnerability accumulated through a combination of large impersonal geological and climatic forces and at least one very personal decision made in 1938 about a South American rodent. There is also something worth noting about the scale of the current operation because the context of storm vulnerability and coastal retreat can make it easy to picture a small, fragile enterprise clinging to an embattled island. The reality is considerably more complex. 700,000 bottles per day is not a small operation by any reasonable standard. The pepper supply for that volume of production comes from farms in Central and South America, in Honduras, Colombia, and elsewhere, grown under contract by farmers who cultivate the specific Tabasco variety to the specifications the company requires for flavor consistency. The raw material travels to the island, is processed there, ages in the white oak barrels that have been part of the process since Edmund's first batches, and leaves as finished product that travels to 195 countries. The company Edmund started in 1868 with 658 bottles and a recycled cologne bottle design, now produces more bottles in a single hour than he produced in his first year of commercial sales. The levee holds the water out. The marsh keeps retreating. The bottles keep filling at 700,000 per day. The great-great-grandson with the Oxford ecology degree keeps working on the problem. These things are all happening simultaneously, in the same place, on an island in the Louisiana marshes that is sitting on a column of salt that goes deeper than Everest is tall. The offers have arrived with regularity. Large food conglomerates. The kind of corporations that manage portfolios of brands the way other institutions manage investment portfolios have approached the McIlhenny family over the years with the kind of serious financial interest that reflects a serious commercial assessment of what the product is worth. The estimated current valuation of the company sits somewhere between $2 and $3 billion, which is a figure that tends to produce a particular quality of attention in anyone managing large amounts of capital looking for returns. $2 to $3 billion is not a hypothetical number. It is the kind of number that, if placed on a table in front of most families that have been running a small manufacturing operation for 150 years, would generate a discussion at minimum. The McIlhenny family has not had that discussion. Or rather, and this is the more interesting possibility, they have had it, and consistently arrived at the same answer without it being particularly close. There has been no dramatic family meeting, no agonizing internal debate, no faction pushing for a sale against a faction pushing to hold. 5 generations of ownership, and none of them have voted to sell. In a world where family businesses routinely fracture across generations as different branches develop different financial needs and different relationships to the original enterprise, this consistency is not the default outcome. It is a specific choice, made repeatedly, across time periods and economic circumstances that have varied enormously. Understanding why requires thinking about what the company actually is to the family, which is not fully captured by the word company. The McIlhenny operation is not a financial asset that the family happens to own. It is, in a more fundamental sense, the material expression of what the family has been for 5 generations, the activity through which the family has organized its time, directed its energy, defined its members' roles, and connected itself to a specific place. Selling it would not be like selling a stock holding or divesting a property. It would be more like selling the noun that answers the question of what the family is. That is a different kind of transaction, and it explains why the financial logic of the offers, which is genuine and substantial, has not been sufficient to move the needle. There is also the specific character of the thing being considered for sale. The product is not a commodity. It is not a brand that has been licensed to a manufacturer who could replicate it anywhere with any ownership structure. It is a product that is inseparable from a specific process conducted in a specific location by people with a specific institutional knowledge of how to do it correctly. The fermentation process, the white oak barrels, the island salt, the aging period, the precise calibration of when peppers are ready for harvest, and when the fermented mash is ready for the vinegar addition. All of this knowledge lives in the organization in ways that formal documentation can partially capture but cannot fully transfer. You can write down the steps. You cannot write down the accumulated judgment of knowing when something is right, which is the part that actually matters when the formal steps produce ambiguous results. A corporate acquirer buying the McIlhenny Company would be buying a brand, a trademark, a customer base, and a manufacturing facility. They would not be buying the thing that makes those other things worth what they are worth, because that thing is not transferable. This is not a mystical claim. It is a practical observation about the difference between the formal and informal components of a production operation that has been refined over 150 years by people for whom the quality of the output was personal rather than professional. The sauce in the bottle is the right sauce because generations of people who cared about it being right made thousands of decisions, large and small, in favour of quality over convenience. A new owner with different incentive structures would not necessarily make the same decisions, and the product would, over time, drift from what it is. Not dramatically or immediately. Drifts of this kind tend to be gradual and hard to see until they have accumulated into something undeniable. But the drift would happen, and what would be worth $2 to $3 billion would slowly become worth something else. The royal warrant of appointment granted by Queen Elizabeth II in 2009 is a piece of documentation that reflects, from the outside, what the family has built from the inside. A royal warrant is issued by the British monarchy to suppliers who have provided products or services to the royal household for a minimum period, and who meet the specific quality and consistency standards that the appointment implies. The McIlhenny Company had been supplying Tabasco sauce to the British royal household for long enough and consistently enough that they qualified for the designation, which is printed on the bottle and displayed with a kind of restrained pride that the British monarchy tends to prefer in the people it is endorsing. It is, practically speaking, a quality certification from one of the more demanding institutional customers in the world, who has been ordering the same product for long enough to form a definitive opinion of it. Receiving it in 2009, on the product's 141st year of commercial production, suggests the quality had been maintained across the full span of the company's existence to the satisfaction of a customer with very specific standards and no particular obligation to renew the relationship if the product had declined. The global reach of the product is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. 195 countries receive Tabasco sauce produced on a 2-mile-long island in the Louisiana marshes. The pepper supply that feeds the production at 700,000 bottles per day comes from farms in Honduras, Colombia, Ecuador, and several other countries in Central and South America, as well as from growing operations in Africa, a global agricultural network organized around a single product specification, maintained to produce peppers that ferment in the specific way that the process requires. The farmers who grow these peppers are doing so to the McIlhenny Company's specifications for the Tabasco variety, selecting for the specific capsaicin content and fruit size and ripeness indicators that the company's quality process requires. The chain of custody from pepper farm to finished bottle spans multiple continents and involves hundreds of thousands of individual agricultural decisions, all of them oriented toward producing the input for a process that happens in one place, that everything converges on the island, that the global supply chain ends at a facility in Iberia Parish, Louisiana, where the barrels sit and the fermentation happens and the bottles fill, is a logistical choice with commercial costs. It would be cheaper, in pure logistics terms, to locate production facilities closer to the major markets, rather than shipping finished product from a single location across the world. The family has not made that choice, for reasons that parallel their reasons for not selling. The island is where the process is. The process is what makes the product. Moving the process is not obviously possible without changing the product, and changing the product is not something the family is willing to do in exchange for lower shipping costs. This specificity of place creates a commercial proposition that is, in the current era of global brand management, almost anachronistic. Most major food brands are produced in multiple facilities on multiple continents, their consistent quality maintained through documented processes, standardized inputs, and quality control systems sophisticated enough to ensure that a bottle produced in Belgium tastes like a bottle produced in Ohio. The McIlhenny Company maintains its consistency through a different mechanism, by refusing to produce anywhere except the one place where all the variables are already controlled by a century and a half of accumulated institutional knowledge. Both approaches can produce consistent quality. Only one of them requires that the island in Louisiana continue to function. The central question that the beginning of this account posed, why Edmund McIlhenny never mentioned the hot sauce in his memoirs, has an answer that is both simple and surprisingly rich once you sit with it. Edmund did not write about the sauce because he did not consider the sauce the thing worth writing about. He was a banker. He had built a banking career of genuine distinction, operated 5 institutions, managed the financial relationships of a significant portion of the New Orleans plantation economy, and accumulated a personal fortune that, before the war destroyed it, represented a genuinely remarkable achievement by any measure available to him. That is what Edmund would have called his career. That is the thing he would have had in mind when organising the narrative of his own life. The source was what came after the career ended. It was a practical response to a set of circumstances he had not chosen. A ruined island, a worthless currency, a family that needed feeding, no working infrastructure for the kind of financial business he actually knew how to run. He made something from the peppers because the peppers were there, and the idea was workable, and the market existed in a modest regional form, and he needed income. He made it carefully because he was a careful person. He made it consistently because consistency was a professional value he had developed across a different career and which transferred, without any particular philosophical adjustment, to fermented pepper mash. He priced it at a premium because he understood, from banking, the difference between positioning something as valuable and positioning it as cheap, and he preferred the former. None of these decisions felt to Edmund like the decisions of someone building a legacy. They felt like the decisions of a practical person solving a practical problem with the resources at hand. The fact that the problem he was solving turned out not to be temporary, that the condiment he produced as a bridge between the collapse of one career and the eventual establishment of another never needed a replacement because it became the thing itself, was not something Edmund anticipated. He died in 1890 with a business that had 20 years of commercial history and a regional market and genuine momentum, but without any reason to believe it would still be operating in the next century, let alone the one after that. He was a banker who made some hot sauce. The hot sauce outlasted the banking career, the Confederate currency, the plantation economy, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, 30 years of trademark litigation, a hurricane, and every offer anyone has made to buy it. There is a category of insight that you can only see from the outside, looking back across a long enough span of time. From inside a moment, you cannot tell the difference between something that will matter for a year and something that will matter for a century and a half. Edmund could not see, in 1868, that the cologne bottle he was filling with fermented pepper mash was the beginning of something that his great-great-grandchildren would still be managing from the same island. He saw a practical solution to an immediate problem. The distance between those two things, between a temporary measure and an enduring institution, is not usually a function of the quality of the original idea. It is a function of what happens after the idea, who continues it, and how carefully, and whether the people carrying it forward understand what is essential and what is not. The McElhenney family understood, across 5 generations, what was essential: the island, the process, the specific combination of ingredients in a specific sequence under specific conditions, the name, which they fought for across decades because without it, the specific thing they had made would dissolve into the generic category around it, the quality, which they maintained not because quality was a marketing message, but because quality was the product, and the product was the point. Each generation inherited these commitments and honoured them in the specific way the circumstances of their era required. Through post-war reconstruction, through trademark litigation, through international expansion, through world wars, through environmental management, through the ongoing problem of a retreating coast. The commitments themselves did not change. The work required to honour them changed constantly. The result is an institution that is, in commercial terms, one of the most successful private food companies in American history. And that is, in human terms, one of the more interesting examples of what it looks like when a family decides that what it has made is worth keeping more than it is worth selling. Not every family makes this decision. Not every family that makes it is right. There are plenty of cases where family loyalty to an enterprise has sustained something that should have been allowed to end. But in this case, the thing being sustained has a quality and a specificity and an accumulated institutional identity that justifies the sustaining. The $2 to $3 billion valuation is not an argument for selling. It is, from the family's perspective, the most precise measurement of what they have built, which is also to say, of what they would be giving up if they sold it. 700,000 bottles per day, 195 countries, a royal warrant from the British monarchy, a facility in a Louisiana marsh that is protected by a 5-metre levee and surrounded by the accumulated consequences of a century and a half of decisions, good ones and bad ones, brilliant ones and genuinely catastrophic ones, made by people who cared about the place and the product and the relationship between them, with a consistency that the commercial record reflects but does not fully capture. Edmund McIlhenny was a banker who made some hot sauce. He did not write about the sauce because he did not think it was the story. He was wrong, which is a kind of wrongness that most people would, on reflection, be happy to be. Good night, and sweet dreams.